The summer of 1887 came to Black Hollow. The way bad news always does, what? Slow at first, then all at once. By July, the creek that fed Hester's mill had dropped to a trickle. By August, the trickle had become a memory. The grass in the lower pastures turned the color of old bone, and the cattle that grazed there grew lean and restless, pressing their weight against the fence lines as if they could sense something their owners hadn't admitted yet, that the land itself was giving up. Black Hollow had never been a prosperous town. It sat in a shallow basin between two ridgelines in the Western Territory, the kind of place that cartographers marked on maps only because someone had to. 200 and some odd souls, a general store with a lopsided porch, a saloon that doubled as a courthouse when the circuit judge bothered to come through, a church with a bell that no longer had its rope, and a scattering of ranches that stretched out from the town's edge like fingers trying to hold on to the earth. Most people who passed through Black Hollow kept passing. The ones who stayed did so because they had nowhere else to go, or because something, land, memory, love, debt, had planted its roots in them before they knew to run. Gideon Mercer was one of those people. He had come to Black Hollow 15 years ago with his young wife Eleanor, a woman from a good Ohio family who had looked at the raw, unbroken land and said, "We can make something here." Not with the dreamy optimism of a fool. Eleanor was no fool, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had looked at a problem and already begun solving it in her mind, and for 10 years they had. The Mercer Ranch was never the biggest operation in the territory, but it was clean and it was honest, and the cattle they raised were healthy. They had plans drawn in pencil on the back of an almanac, revised and re-revised over winter evenings at the kitchen table. A proper house, not just the two-room structure they'd put up in the first year, but a real house with 4 rooms and a proper window that faced east, so Eleanor could watch the sunrise with her coffee. They had started building it in the spring of 1884. Gideon had hauled the timber himself, felled from the ridge pines and dragged down the slope on a sled. Eleanor had measured the rooms with a rope and iron stakes, walking the perimeter of what would be their future with her hands pressed against her lower back, because by then her belly was already rounding out with the child neither of them could stop smiling about. They got the frame up. They got the east wall up, halfway. Then came August 14th, 1884. By the morning of August 15th, Gideon Mercer had a half-built wall, a yard full of unused timber, and nothing else. He did not finish the house. He did not talk about why. Nobody in Black Hollow asked. Because in a town like that, people understood the geography of grief even when they couldn't name it. You didn't walk into certain territories. You nodded to a man like Gideon Mercer when you passed him on the road. You took his cattle when he brought them to market. You sold him what he needed at the store, and you did not ask about the half-built east wall of his house, or the room inside it that still had unpainted timber and a window that let in the cold all winter. 3 years had passed. Gideon was 41 years old, and he moved through his days like a man underwater. Not drowning exactly, but not entirely present either. He rose before sunrise. He worked. He ate whatever could be prepared without much thought. Salt pork, dry biscuits, canned beans heated in the tin. He worked until dark. He slept. He rose again. The hands who worked the ranch, 2 men, Cutter and Poe, who had been with him long enough to know better than to make conversation before noon, gave him a wide berth and did their jobs without complaint. They weren't friends exactly. They were men who had reached an understanding with each other about how things would be, and that understanding suited everyone just fine. This was Gideon Mercer's life in the summer of 1887. Functional, joyless, sufficient. I was in his own estimation doing fine. She arrived on a Wednesday, which Gideon would always remember because Wednesday was the day he drove the wagon into town for supplies, and he very nearly didn't see her at all. He had been loading flour sacks into the wagon bed outside Harmon's general store when he heard voices coming from the direction of the stage depot, which was really just a covered platform with a bench, but the stage stopped there 3 times a week, and today was apparently one of those days. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but the boarding house is full up." "Full up? You have 3 rooms. 2 of 'em's got families staying. The 3rd's got a broken floor." "How broken?" A pause. "Broken enough." Gideon didn't look up immediately. He finished tying the flour sacks and moved around to check the wagon's left wheel, which had been wobbling slightly on the last trip. When he finally did look up, because the argument seemed to be continuing without any sign of resolution, He saw them. Cy Brandt, who ran the boarding house and generally ran his mouth about everything else, was standing with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, wearing the particular expression of a man who had already decided the answer was no and was simply waiting for the question to stop. And across from him stood a woman who was, at that moment, staring at him with the focused intensity of someone who had not come this far to be defeated by a broken floor. She was not what you'd call conventionally beautiful, not in the way the magazines from back east depicted women with their soft, carefully arranged features and their hair piled up in fashionable towers. She was, in the plainest terms, a woman who looked like she had worked for everything she had and expected to keep working. Tall, angular, with dark hair that had come partially loose from its pins during what had clearly been a long and unpleasant journey. Her dress was practical gray wool, travel-worn and dusty. She had one trunk at her feet, just the one, and she was holding a carpet bag in her left hand like she was prepared to use it as a weapon if necessary. "All right," she said to Cy Brandt, with the controlled patience of someone who had already burned through the uncontrolled kind. "If the floor is broken, I'll sleep around the hole. Where is it?" "Ma'am, I am not asking for the Ritz Hotel. I'm asking for a room with a door that closes and enough floor to set a cot on. Now, is that possible or not?" Gideon finished with the wheel and straightened up. He was not a man who involved himself in other people's business. He had enough of his own. He climbed up onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. He sat there for a moment. He looked at the woman. He looked at her trunk. He looked at the single carpet bag. He thought about the barn. He put the reins down. "Excuse me," he said, walking over. Both of them turned. Cy Brandt looked relieved. The woman looked like she was sizing him up and hadn't decided yet what she thought. "Gideon Mercer," he said, not extending his hand because his was dirty from the wheel grease. "I've got a barn, clean one. Got a loft with room enough, and I can put up a partition for privacy if you need it. It's not a boarding house, but it's better than sleeping with a hole in your floor." The woman looked at him steadily. "How far out of town?" 3 miles, maybe a little more." "And you're offering this why?" It was a fair question. Gideon thought about it for a second. "Barn's empty except for 3 horses and a barn cat that mostly stays out of the way. Seems wasteful." She didn't respond immediately. She had very dark eyes, the kind that didn't give much away, and she was using them on him now with an attention that made him feel slightly uncomfortably, as though he were being read. "Vivian Hale," she said finally. She still didn't extend her hand either, which he respected. "I'm a teacher. I've come looking for work. There's no school here." I noticed. She glanced around Black Hollow with the expression of someone cataloging a problem. "That's why there's an opportunity." Gideon picked up her trunk without being asked. It was heavier than he expected. She noticed him adjust his grip and didn't comment on it, which he also respected. "Wagon's over there," he said. The drive back to the ranch was mostly silent, which suited Gideon fine and didn't seem to bother Vivian Hale either. She sat on the bench seat beside him and watched the landscape pass with alert, curious eyes, taking in the dry grass, the distant ridgelines, the particular quality of the afternoon light that fell across the basin in long amber slants. After about a mile, she said, "How long has the town been struggling?" "What makes you say it's struggling?" 3 empty storefronts on the main street. Boarding house that can't fix a broken floor. Stage depot with a bench that's missing 2 slats. She paused. "And you?" Gideon kept his eyes on the road. "What about me?" "You offered a stranger your barn. Already told you why. You said it was wasteful. That's not a reason. That's an excuse." He looked at her then. She was watching the road ahead, her profile calm, not particularly concerned about whether she'd overstepped. He turned back to the road. "Town's been struggling since the creek dropped," he said. "That's 3 summers now." "And before the creek?" "Before the creek, it was the price of beef. Before the beef, it was the winter of '82. He exhaled through his nose. "Black Hollow's been struggling since I've known it. Some towns are built to thrive. Some are built to survive. Black Hollow's the second kind." "Which kind do you prefer?" He didn't answer that. She didn't push it. That, too, he respected. The ranch came into view around the last bend. The main house first, low and practical, then the barn beyond it. Red paint faded to a dusty rose, and behind that the fence line stretching out toward the east pasture. And there, at the east end of the house, visible from the road if you knew to look, the unfinished wall. The raw timber, silver gray with 3 years of weather. The gap where the window was supposed to be, boarded up with two planks nailed at angles. Vivian saw it. He felt her see it the way you feel a draft from an open door. Not dramatically, just a slight change in the air. She didn't say anything. He pulled the wagon around to the barn and helped her down, which she accepted without comment. He showed her the loft, a good-sized space above the horse stalls, with a hay-stuffed mattress on a wooden frame that one of the hands had used 2 winters ago. Clean enough? Dry. There's a water pump at the south side of the house, he said. You can use it. Outhouse is behind the barn. I'll put up a curtain partition up here tonight. Cutter and Poe, those are my ranch hands. They sleep in the bunkhouse over there, so this is separate. She nodded, setting her carpet bag down and looking around the loft with the assessing gaze of someone who had clearly slept in worse places. What are the terms? She asked. What? Terms. For the shelter. You said it was an exchange, wasteful not to use the space. So what are you expecting in return? Gideon stood at the top of the loft ladder, feeling slightly wrong-footed. He had not, in fact, thought about terms. He had acted on something closer to instinct than calculation, which was unusual enough for him that he hadn't examined it yet. Nothing, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Nothing now, he corrected. If you get your school going and you're still here in 6 months, you can cook on Sundays. I eat cold biscuits most Sundays, and I'm tired of it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then for the first time, something in her face softened, just briefly, just at the corners of her eyes, the almost suggestion of a smile that wasn't quite a smile. That's an honest answer, she said. I try. He climbed back down the ladder and went to see about a curtain. Vivian Hale had been many things before she arrived in Black Hollow, and she had been none of them easily. She had been a student at the Hartwell Female Seminary in Connecticut until she was 19 when the seminary's funding collapsed and the building was sold at auction while the students were still in it. She had been a governess in Philadelphia for 2 years, tutoring the children of a shipping merchant whose wife was pleasant and whose husband was not. She had been a school teacher in a proper Missouri town for 3 years, which ended when the town school board, 5 men who had never sat in a classroom in their adult lives, decided that a woman without a husband teaching other people's children was, in the precise words of their written notification, an irregularity that reflects poorly on the institution. She had spent the following year moving west, following opportunity the way water follows a slope, not by choice so much as by the logic of gravity. And she had come to Black Hollow because she had heard, from a woman in a boarding house in Laramie, that the territory had settlements desperate for teachers and not enough people desperate enough to be one. Vivian was exactly that desperate, but desperation, in her experience, was not the opposite of strength. It was the beginning of it. She was up before Gideon the next morning. He came out of the house at 5:15 to find her sitting on the fence rail at the edge of the east pasture, a battered notebook open across her knees and a pencil moving across the page with quick, purposeful strokes. The sunrise was still just a pink suggestion along the ridgeline. He stopped. She hadn't heard him. He stood there for a moment, watching her write, feeling like he'd come around a corner and found something that wasn't supposed to be there. Not in a threatening way, just in the way that certain unexpected things require a moment of adjustment. He cleared his throat. She looked up. No startlement, no defensive tucking away of the notebook. Just a calm, direct look. Good morning, she said. What are you writing? Lists. She held up the notebook slightly. Families in the area with children school age. Likely to be interested. Unlikely to be interested. Ones I'll need to visit in person versus ones who might come to me. He walked closer, not to read the notebook, but because standing at a distance in his own yard felt strange. You don't know anyone here yet. I know Cy Brandt has a daughter about 9 years old. I know the man at the livery stable has twin boys, maybe 7. I know the woman who runs the dry goods counter has a son who looks about 12 and who was stacking shelves yesterday when he was clearly supposed to be doing something else. She paused. Children tell you a lot about a town, so do the places they're not. Gideon looked at her. The places they're not. There was no schoolyard, no chalkboard visible through any window, no children playing in the street yesterday afternoon, which in a town that size means either they're all working or there's nowhere for them to be. She closed the notebook. So I made a list of children. Of futures, she said simply, and climbed down from the fence rail. Is there coffee? He told her that first week very little about himself. He told her the practical things, where the water was, how the pump worked when it stuck, which section of fence the horses liked to test in wet weather, what times Cutter and Poe generally came and went. He told her which families in the area he thought she might approach first, not because she asked, but because he found himself, unexpectedly, with opinions on the matter. The Rourkes, he said one evening, sitting on the porch steps while Vivian worked at the small table she'd set up just inside the barn door, writing lesson plans by lamplight. Ed Rourke's got 4 kids, 3 of them school age, and Ed's wife, Clara. She was a schoolgirl back in Iowa before they moved out here. She'll want her kids to learn. She'll be your biggest advocate if you get her early. What about Ed? Ed cares about his cattle, but Ed does what Clara says mostly. Vivian wrote something down. Who would be opposed? Walt Houghton. He runs the biggest operation north of town. Thinks book learning makes boys soft and girls uppity. He's got 2 boys and a girl. What do you think? Gideon looked at the middle distance. I think Walt Houghton's been saying the same 3 things his whole life and considers that an education. Vivian made a sound that might have been a laugh, very small and quickly contained. She wrote something else down. You don't have children, she said. It was not quite a question. The pause that followed was the length of a held breath. No, he said. She did not look up from her writing. I'm sorry, she said, quietly, without theater. The way people say it when they actually mean it, rather than when they're filling silence. It was a long time ago, Gideon said, which was true, and also completely meaningless, because time does not do what people claim it does. It doesn't heal. It just accumulates. He stood up and went inside. On the 9th day after her arrival, Vivian Hale held her first class. It happened under the broad cottonwood tree at the south edge of Gideon's property. A massive old tree, easily 50 years old, its trunk 3 feet across, and its canopy spreading wide enough to shade a considerable patch of ground. She had asked Gideon if she could use the space. He had shrugged and said it was just a tree. She had gathered 7 children. 7 out of a community that had perhaps 40 school-age young people, but 7 was not nothing. She had a slate board propped against a fence post. She had chalk. She had 2 books from her trunk, a reader and an arithmetic primer, both of them worn soft with use. Gideon watched from the barn doorway, pretending not to. The children ranged from maybe 6 to 13. Clara Rourke had sent 3 of her 4. The youngest, she said, was not yet settled enough. 2 more came from the Haverford farm, and one, a thin, watchful girl of about 11, had apparently walked 4 miles from a homestead Gideon didn't even know had children on it. Vivian did not stand at the head of the group the way he expected her to. She sat down in the grass with them and said, Tell me what you already know. Doesn't matter what it is. Anything you know, tell me. The children exchanged glances. The oldest Rourke boy said he knew how to read cattle brands. Good, said Vivian. That's reading. Tell me how. And she meant it. She leaned forward and listened as an 11-year-old boy explained the logic of cattle brands with the seriousness of a professor, and she asked questions that were not condescending, and she connected what he said to the letters on the slate board with a naturalness that made it seem like the boy had been teaching reading all along and simply hadn't known it. Gideon went back to his work. He couldn't explain later why the back of his throat felt so tight. The trouble started, as trouble in small towns usually does, with a conversation that was never meant to be kind. It was Mabel Stokes who started it. Mabel, who ran the boarding house that had no room for Vivian, whose memory for perceived slights had no apparent upper limit. She started it at the counter of Harmon's General Store, in a voice pitched at the precise volume required for everyone in the room to hear without any single person being able to claim she'd been broadcasting. I'm only saying, Mabel said, to nobody in particular and everybody in general, it's peculiar. A woman with no family, no letter of reference from any school district anyone's heard of, and she's living on a man's property. She's in the barn, said Tom Harmon, not looking up from his ledger. She's on his property, Mabel repeated with the emphasis of someone who considered the distinction both clear and meaningless. Gideon was in the store. He heard it. He set down the tin of nails he was looking at and said, without turning around, Miss Hale has her own space. My ranch hands have a bunkhouse. She's in the loft. Gideon, nobody's suggesting 7 children learning to read under my cottonwood tree, he said. He turned around then. Ed Rourke's kids. Haverford's 2. that Hendricks girl who walked 4 miles by herself to be there. You want to have a conversation about Miss Hale's character, Mabel, you go ahead and have it, but have it to my face. Mabel Stokes went slightly pink. Tom Harmon's pencil scratched steadily across the ledger. Gideon paid for his nails and left. He did not tell Vivienne about the conversation. He wasn't sure why, except that she had enough to manage without knowing that the town's most reliable gossip was already cataloging her presence as a moral irregularity. She would find out on her own eventually. Things like that always surfaced, but there was no reason to hurry it. What he did not expect was that she already knew. Mrs. Stokes spoke to Mrs. Rourke, Vivienne said that evening, not looking up from the stack of papers she was organizing at her table. Apparently there are concerns about my situation. Gideon, who had been about to eat his supper in peace, set down his fork. Clara Rourke tell you that? Clara Rourke told me that and then said, and I'm quoting directly, "Anyone who makes my boys sit still for 2 hours and actually like it can live in my front parlor for all I care." She looked up, a very small smile. "I thought you should know that you have an ally." "I don't need an ally." "No," she agreed, "but it's nice to have one." He picked up his fork again. He ate 3 bites before he said, "You're not concerned about what Mabel Stokes is saying?" "I've been not concerned about what women like Mabel Stokes are saying since I was 22 years old," Vivienne said pleasantly. "I find it takes less energy than being concerned." Gideon looked at her. "She's not wrong, you know," Vivienne said after a moment. Her voice had changed slightly, dropped the lightness, become more careful. "My situation is irregular. A woman alone, no formal credentials here, no letter of reference, living in a stranger's barn." She stacked the papers neatly. "If I were someone else, I might be suspicious of me too." "Are you telling me something?" "I'm being transparent," she said. "You gave me shelter without knowing anything about me. I think you deserve more than what you've gotten so far." She looked at him steadily. "Ask me whatever you want." He sat with that for a moment. Outside, one of the horses shifted in a stall. A nighthawk called twice and went silent. "Why did you leave Missouri?" he asked. Something moved across her face. Not pain exactly, but the cousin of it. "The school board let me go." "Why?" "Because I was unmarried and they thought it was improper." She said it flatly, without resentment, which somehow made it more pointed. "Was that the only reason?" A pause. "No," she said. "There was also the matter of me teaching the Sherman boy to read." "What's wrong with that?" "The Sherman boy," she said quietly, "was colored. His mother worked in the laundry. He was 8 years old, and he wanted to learn to read, and I taught him the same way I taught every other child in that school." She straightened a paper that didn't need straightening. "The school board considered that a second irregularity." Gideon was quiet for a long time. "All right," he said finally. "All right what?" "All right, I know what I needed to know." She looked at him. He stood up, took his plate to the wash basin, and began cleaning it with the methodical attention of a man who was thinking very carefully about something else. "The Hendricks girl," he said after a moment. "The one who walked 4 miles. Her father's been in a bad way since his wife died. He won't come to you. You'll need to go to him. Take something practical. Food, if you can manage it. He won't accept charity, but he'll accept a neighbor." Vivienne was quiet. "I know where the farm is," Gideon continued. "I'll take you out there Thursday, if you want." She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was careful and even, the voice of someone holding something steady. "Thank you, Gideon." He dried his plate and put it on the shelf. "Get some sleep," he said. "You've got a full class tomorrow." 3 weeks after Vivienne Hale set up her school under the cottonwood tree, she had 14 students. 3 weeks after that, she had 22. It was not orderly growth. It was messy and inconsistent, and 2 of the children only came when their farm chores permitted, which meant some weeks they were there every day and some weeks not at all. One boy, a Rourke cousin who had recently turned 14, decided that school was for babies and stopped coming for 9 days before his mother essentially frog-marched him back. An older girl, Josephine Haverford, turned out to read at a level years beyond her age and consumed every book in Vivienne's trunk in 2 weeks, requiring an emergency letter to the Territorial Lending Library in Cheyenne. Gideon wrote the letter. He didn't tell Vivienne he had. He just put it in the mail on his next supply run, and when the package arrived 3 weeks later with 4 new books, he left it on her table without comment. She knew it had been him. She didn't make a thing of it. That was becoming a pattern between them. small actions, unremarked upon. She cooked on Sundays without being asked to begin, and the food was better than anything Gideon had eaten in 3 years. He repaired the loft floor without being asked, shoring up a board that had started to flex under her daily use. She brought his coffee to the porch in the mornings when she rose before him, which was most mornings. He made sure the lamp oil was always full so she could work late. Neither of them spoke about any of it directly. It was simply the grammar of living in proximity to another person, a language learned sentence by sentence, entirely without words. What was harder to manage were the moments of collision. They happened most often in the evenings, when the work was done and the light went from gold to gray, and there was nothing left to attend to but each other. These were the moments Gideon trusted least, because in those moments his discipline, the careful, maintained distance he kept from everything that might matter, tended to slip in ways he didn't notice until it already had. One evening, Vivian had come into the house to get something from the kitchen and found Gideon standing in front of the open doorway to the unfinished room. Just standing there, not doing anything. The room was dark beyond him, empty of everything except the rough timber walls and the dirt floor and the 2 planks nailed across where the window would have been. She had stopped in the kitchen doorway. She didn't say anything. After a moment, Gideon said, without turning, she wanted it to face east, so she could see the sunrise. Vivian didn't move, didn't speak. I got the frame up. I got the east wall up to where it needed to go. He stopped. He had not said any of this aloud to another person. Ever. The words felt strange in his mouth, like objects he'd found in the dark. She died in August. The baby too. Neither of them. He stopped again. He didn't turn around. He pulled the door to the unfinished room shut and stood facing it for one more moment. I'm sorry, Vivian said. The same 2 words she'd said before, on the porch steps. The same quiet, unadorned weight. I know, he said. He turned around. She was standing in the kitchen doorway with his coffee cup in her hand. She'd come in for the coffee, apparently, and she was looking at him with her dark eyes that didn't give things away, except that right now they were giving something away. Not pity. Not quite that. Something more careful than pity and more honest. He crossed the kitchen and took the cup from her hand. Thank you, he said, for the coffee, for not asking anything else, for being exactly where she was and no closer. Good night, she said. Good night, Vivian. The man who arrived in Black Hollow in late September was not the kind of man who announced himself. He came in on the stage, which was unremarkable enough, and he took a room at the boarding house, which had apparently found a way to fix its floor. He wore a suit that was too good for the territory, not outrageously expensive, but carefully maintained, the kind of suit you kept up when you wanted people to think you had money without wanting to advertise exactly how much. He carried a leather satchel. He did not visit the saloon. He did not talk to people he didn't need to talk to. His name was Rollins. He told people he was passing through on business. People in Black Hollow, who had grown accustomed to minding their own business, mostly believed him. Gideon's foreman Cutter, who had grown accustomed to watching people's business because it was in his nature, noticed that Rollins took a very particular interest in the roads north of town. The North Road, Cutter said one evening, sitting on an upturned bucket outside the bunkhouse and working a piece of leather. He stood there for near on an hour today, just looking up it. What's up the North Road? Vivian asked. She had taken to sitting outside in the evenings when the weather permitted, marking lessons on her papers in the fading light. North Road goes up to Houghton's Range, Gideon said. Cutter nodded. And then past it. Connects to the Territorial Road east eventually. Long way around. Why would someone want to go east the long way? Vivian asked. They wouldn't, Gideon said, unless they didn't want to be seen going. Cutter set down his leather work and looked at Gideon. Gideon looked back at him. Something passed between them that was below the level of words. The understanding of 2 men who had both spent enough years on the frontier to recognize a certain quality of stillness in a person that had nothing to do with peace. I'll keep an eye on him, Cutter said. Don't make it obvious. Never do. October came and the days shortened and the air along the ridgelines turned the particular cold that meant winter was not a threat but a schedule. Vivian's school had become, in the way that good things sometimes do, slightly more than anyone had planned. The families who had children attending began gradually to stay after lessons when they came to collect their young people, at first just standing and talking, then gradually bringing things. A jar of preserved plums from Clara Rourke, a spare bench from Ed Haverford that he'd built over the summer, 3 old McGuffey readers that someone had found in the back of a trunk. The cottonwood tree became, without anyone declaring it so, a gathering point. On the last Saturday of each month, people from 3 or 4 surrounding ranches began arriving around midday with food and tools and a general willingness to fix things that needed fixing. This was not organized by Vivian, or rather, it was organized by Vivian in the way that water organizes a riverbed, not through force, but through consistent direction. Gideon watched it happen. He did not know how to feel about it, which was unusual, because he had spent 3 years being very clear about how he felt about everything. Bad. That was the feeling. A low, steady, endurable bad that he had made his permanent condition and organized his life around. It was not happiness, but it was solid ground. And solid ground was something. The problem with Vivian Hale, and he was increasingly aware of this, the way you become aware of a stone in your boot over a long enough walk, was that she was systematically, cheerfully, and entirely without mercy dismantling the solid ground. She did it by being present, by being, in the simplest terms, there in a way that people hadn't been there for him in a very long time, by asking him, every so often, a question that he couldn't answer with one word, by looking at him when she thought he wasn't watching with those dark eyes that she was very bad at keeping neutral when she forgot to be careful. He was not a man who fell into things. He had built himself, over 3 years, into someone who didn't fall. I was aware, on a cold Tuesday evening in early October, watching Vivian read by the lamplight in the barn doorway. Her hair down for once, her feet tucked under her, the cat that normally didn't come near anyone curled improbably in her lap, that the awareness was no longer merely intellectual. He went to bed and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours, and then told himself firmly that the whole situation required more careful management. He was not convincing himself. The next morning he rose before dawn and rode out to check the north fence line, which didn't need checking. He did it because he needed to be somewhere he could think without the lamplit barn and the woman and the cat constituting an argument against thinking clearly. He rode for an hour in the cold early light, his breath and the horses making small clouds on the still air. The land was beautiful in the way that empty land is beautiful, big and indifferent and very old. He had loved it once without reservation. He had come to it with Eleanor and loved it with her, and after she was gone he had kept loving it in the diminished way you love something when half of what made it meaningful is absent. It was still beautiful. He sat on his horse on the ridge above the east pasture and looked at the basin below him. The town in the distance, small and quiet in the early light, and his ranch in the middle ground, the barn and the house, and the unfinished east wall that even from this distance was visible as a wound in the structure. And he thought, very carefully, about what he was going to do. He didn't have an answer when he rode back down, but something in him was moving that had not moved in 3 years, and that was both the most frightening and, somewhere underneath the fear, the most precise feeling of being alive he'd had in longer than he could honestly account for. He put his horse in the barn and went to make coffee. Vivian's lamp was already lit in the loft above him. "Good morning," she called down, without looking. "Morning," he said, and stood for a moment in the quiet, in the smell of hay and leather and the cold autumn air, listening to the scratch of her pencil and the sound of the horses settling. Then he put the kettle on. The cold came early that year, the way it sometimes does in high country. Not gradually, not with any polite warning, but all at once, like a door slamming open in the middle of the night. By the second week of October, the ground along the north fence was iron hard by morning, and the cottonwood tree that had served as Vivian's classroom since September had dropped half its leaves in a single windy afternoon, leaving the children sitting in a circle of yellow and brown with the sky raw and gray above them. It was Clara Rourke who said what needed to be said. She arrived one Thursday morning with her 3 children and a covered dish of cornbread, took one look at the lesson in progress. Vivian standing at the slate board with her coat buttoned to the chin and her breath making small clouds in the air, 8 children hunched over their papers with their fingers going stiff, and said, very plainly, "This won't do." Vivian turned around. "Mrs. Rourke, you need a building," Clara said. "Not next spring, now." "I'm aware of that." "Then what's the plan?" Vivian was quiet for a moment. She had been turning this problem over in her mind for 2 weeks, approaching it from different angles the way you circle a horse you're not sure of. The town had no schoolhouse. The church had its space, but Reverend Aldous had made it quietly clear that the church building was the church's business, and he'd prefer it stay that way. The saloon, which was the largest interior space in Black Hollow besides the livery, was suggested twice, both times as a joke, and Vivian had filed it away as a genuine possibility if things got desperate enough. "I'm working on it," she said. Clara Rourke looked at her the way women look at each other when they both know working on it means you don't have one yet. "My husband's got a wall tent," she said. "It's not warm, but it's better than wind. We can put it up this weekend if Gideon will let us use his south field." Vivian opened her mouth. "Don't argue," Clara said. "Just tell me if you want it." "I want it," Vivian said. The cornbread was still warm. Vivian distributed it to the children, who received it with the uncomplicated gratitude of people for whom warm food is not an abstraction. That was how it started. Not with a plan, but with a wall tent and a woman who didn't ask permission before solving problems. Gideon said yes to the south field without hesitation, which Clara Rourke seemed to find faintly surprising. He helped Ed Rourke and two of the Haverford men put the tent up on Saturday morning, driving the stakes himself while Cutter held the canvas against the wind. It was a large tent, military surplus, the kind used for field hospitals, high enough to stand in, wide enough for 2 rows of children to sit with a narrow aisle between them. It was not a schoolhouse, but it had walls and a roof, and when Vivian hung a length of burlap across the entry and weighted it at the bottom with stones, the temperature inside climbed to something survivable within an hour of the small iron stove Poe had hauled out from the bunkhouse. "That stove's been sitting unused for 2 years, Poe told Vivian when she tried to thank him. He was a quiet man, Poe. Thin, sun-weathered, not given to unnecessary speech. Seemed right. Vivian looked at him steadily. "Thank you, Mr. Poe." Poe nodded once and went back to his work. That was the entirety of his participation, and it was also completely sufficient. By Monday, 26 children were crowded into the tent for the morning lesson. So, the man named Rollins left Black Hollow. The same weekend the tent went up. He departed on the eastbound stage with his leather satchel and his careful suit, and the town barely noticed him go. Cutter noticed. He watched the stage pull out from the depot platform and then walked back to the ranch and found Gideon in the barn and said, "He's gone." "Toward the east?" "Stage goes east, so yes." Gideon rubbed down the curry comb he'd been using and hung it on its nail. "What do you think?" "I think a man who spends a week staring at back roads and then leaves without talking to a single rancher isn't done with whatever he came here for." Cutter picked up a hay fork and turned it in his hands. "He was looking at grazing land, Gideon, the north parcels, Houghton's range and the unclaimed sections above it." "Who'd want unclaimed sections above Houghton? It's dry country. Creek doesn't reach it." "It's dry now," Cutter said. "Creek comes back. That land's worth something different." Gideon was quiet. He looked at the barn floor. "You think someone's watching the water situation?" "I think someone sent a man to find out if the ranchers here are weak enough to push." Cutter set the hay fork down. "And I think they got their answer." That sat between them for a moment in the cold air of the barn. "Keep your eyes open," Gideon said. "Always do." Vivian knew nothing of this conversation. She was, at that moment, 3 miles away at the Hendricks homestead, sitting across a kitchen table from a man who had not, by the look of things, spoken to another adult in several weeks. Daniel Hendricks was 40-something, hard to tell exactly, because grief ages people at different rates, and Daniel had clearly been aged considerably. He was a rangy man with big hands and the particular hollow quality of someone who had forgotten to eat consistently. His daughter, Iris, the 11-year-old who had walked 4 miles to school and kept walking back, sat in the corner of the kitchen doing something with a length of string, watching the conversation with the careful attention of a child who has had to pay close attention to adult moods for survival. Gideon had driven Vivian out and waited in the wagon, as he'd promised. Inside, Vivian had set the basket of food she'd brought. Bread, a jar of soup Clara Rourke had sent along, dried beans, on the table without comment, and then sat down and said, "Mr. Hendricks, your daughter is one of the most capable students I've taught in 10 years of teaching." Daniel Hendricks looked at her. He had not been expecting that. "She reads above her grade. Her arithmetic is strong. Her handwriting is the best in the class, and I have one boy who's been practicing for 3 months. Vivian folded her hands on the table. "I want to keep teaching her, but I need to know whether that's something you'll support." A long silence. Daniel looked at his daughter. Iris looked back at him with those careful, watchful eyes. She told me, Daniel said finally, about the school. He paused, said it was under a tree. It was. We have a tent now. Something shifted in his face, not quite amusement, but in the neighborhood of it. A tent. Progress is incremental, Vivian said. He looked at the basket on the table. He looked at it for a long time, and his jaw worked slightly, and she could see him deciding something. Not just whether to accept the food, but whether to accept the thing behind it, which was harder and more complicated and required trusting someone he didn't know. She's all I've got, he said quietly. I know, Vivian said. That's why I'm here. He didn't answer immediately. He reached out and moved the basket 2 inches closer to him, which was not nothing. She can keep going, he said. Vivian stood up. Thank you, Mr. Hendricks. Miss Hale. He looked up. She talks about you. At dinner, when she eats. He paused. It's the first time she's talked much at dinner since her mother. Vivian held that carefully. She's a remarkable girl, she said. She came to me. That was her doing. She said goodbye to Iris, who followed her to the door and then, in a quick and slightly awkward motion, hugged her around the middle before retreating back into the kitchen. Vivian stood on the porch for a moment with her hand on the door frame, looking out at the cold gray sky, at Gideon in the wagon with his collar turned up and his hat low. She walked to the wagon and climbed up, and they drove back without speaking for a long time. How'd it go? Gideon asked, eventually. He's going to be all right, she said. Not right now, but eventually. What makes you say that? He opened the basket. She looked at the road ahead. People who are truly broken don't open things. Gideon thought about that for a moment. He thought about it the way you think about something that applies to you without wanting to examine the application directly. Cold's coming in hard tonight, he said. I'll check the stove in the tent before dark. Thank you, she said. They drove the rest of the way home in the comfortable quiet of two people who have run out of words, but not out of things to say. November arrived and the tent held, not comfortably. There were mornings when the stove needed 20 minutes to bring the temperature inside to something that allowed pencils to be held without fingers going white. And there was one particularly brutal week when sleet came in sideways, and 2 of the tent pegs pulled free, and Gideon had to restake them at 7 in the morning while Vivian held the canvas from inside, and the children sat in a circle like small patient survivors. But it held. More importantly, the families held. This was what Vivian had understood from the beginning, though she hadn't yet said it plainly to anyone. The school was never really about reading and arithmetic. Those things mattered deeply, and she taught them with the seriousness they deserved. But what the school was actually building, lesson by lesson, Saturday gathering by Saturday gathering, was something that had been absent from Black Hollow for long enough that people had forgotten to miss it. Trust, the small, daily variety, the kind built from showing up. Clara Rourke had been the first, but she was not the last. Ed Haverford's wife, Margaret, started coming to the Saturday gatherings and bringing her preserving knowledge with her. Within 2 weeks, she and 3 other women had organized a communal canning arrangement that halved the time and doubled the output for all of them. Tom Harmon at the general store began setting aside books that came through with supply shipments, leaving them on the counter with a paper that said simply, "For Miss Hale's school." The Rourke's oldest boy, who had returned to class after his 9-day protest and never mentioned it again, started helping the younger children with their sums without being asked. And Walt Houghton watched all of it from a distance and said nothing, which was more threatening than anything he could have said. Walt Houghton was the largest landowner in the Black Hollow area. 3,000 acres of scrubby but serviceable range, enough cattle to make him consequential, and the particular arrogance of a man who had confused being big with being right for long enough that the distinction had ceased to matter to him. He was not a violent man by temperament. He was something more complicated than that, a man who used the threat of his silence and his size and his money the way other men used fists. He came to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-November, which was unusual. Walt Houghton did not make social calls. Gideon was repairing a section of fence near the house when he saw the horse coming up the road. He recognized Houghton's bay mare and straightened up and waited because there was nothing else to do. "Mercer," Houghton said, reining up. "Walt." Houghton did not get down from the horse. He looked at the tent visible at the south edge of the property, where Vivian's school was currently in session, the faint sound of children's voices audible even at this distance. "That's quite the operation you're running," Houghton said. It's a school. On your land. Last time I checked, I could put what I wanted on my land. Gideon turned the fence pliers over in his hand. Something you need, Walt? Houghton looked at him with the expression of a man who has composed something in advance and is now deciding how much of it to deliver. I've had some inquiries, he said, from a land agent out of Cheyenne, fellow named Rollins. Gideon kept his face still. What kind of inquiries? The buying kind. Houghton shifted in his saddle. He represents a development company. Railroad spur is going through this territory in 3 years, maybe less. Land along the North Corridor is going to be worth considerably more than it is now. He paused. He made me an offer. You taking it? Haven't decided. Houghton looked at the tent again. Thing is, Mercer, a development company isn't interested in buying one piece. They want the corridor. They want the connected parcels. He met Gideon's eyes. That includes yours. Gideon put the fence pliers in his coat pocket. My land's not for sale. Could be worth 4 times what you paid. It's not for sale at 4 times, it's not for sale at any times. Houghton nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's not surprised by an answer, but wants you to know he's noted it. That teacher of yours is stirring things up, he said. Getting people gathering, getting them talking to each other. People talking to each other isn't stirring things up. It's just people talking. Depends what they're talking about. Houghton gathered his reins. You think carefully, Gideon. A man alone on a piece of land that a development company wants is in a particular kind of position, but a man who's got the community behind him. He tilted his head slightly. That's a different kind of position, not always better. What does that mean? Houghton looked at him steadily. It means people who matter to you become people who can be used. He turned the mare and headed back up the road without looking back. Gideon stood by the fence and watched him go. He told Vivienne that evening. He had considered not telling her, the same hesitation he'd had about Mabel Stokes's gossip, the instinct to manage things without involving her. But he thought about what she'd said. You gave me shelter without knowing anything about me. I think you deserve more than what you've gotten so far. That went 2 ways. She listened without interrupting, which he'd noticed was characteristic of her. She gave a thing her full attention before she responded, the way someone who'd learned the hard way that quick reactions weren't always the right ones. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Rollins, she said, land agent, represents a development company. He told her what Cutter had observed, and Houghton's considering selling. He said he hasn't decided, which means he's using the possibility as leverage. Leverage against what? Against me saying no. He exhaled slowly. If Houghton sells the north parcels, the development company has a foothold. They'd want more. They'd start pressuring the smaller ranchers, the Haverford S., the Rourkes, people who can't hold out. Vivienne stood up from the table and walked to the window. Outside, the first real snow of the season was falling, light, tentative, the kind that doesn't mean anything yet. She looked at it for a moment. And his comment about the community, she said. He was telling me that having people here who matter gives them something to pressure. She turned around. He was telling you to get rid of me. He was suggesting it might be easier for everyone. Her jaw tightened very slightly. Not dramatically. She wasn't a dramatic person, but enough. Is that what you're thinking? No, he said. He said it without hesitation, which surprised him slightly, because he hadn't known he was going to be that clear about it until the word was out. She looked at him. Are you sure? I've been pressured by Walt Houghton before. I don't run. I'm not asking whether you run, she said quietly. I'm asking if you're sure that having me here, with everything it's brought, is something you're choosing, not just tolerating. The lamp between them made the shadows warm and unsteady. Outside, the snow kept falling. Vivienne, he said. Yes. I checked on the tent stove 3 times last week at midnight. I wrote a letter to a library in Cheyenne I've never contacted in my life and didn't tell you about it. I drove you 4 miles to a homestead to see a man I've never had a full conversation with. He paused. Does that answer the question? Something in her face went still and then, almost imperceptibly, released. She turned back to the window. Yes, she said. It does. They stood there for a moment, her at the window, him at the table, with the snow outside and the lamp between them, and the particular charged quiet of 2 people who have just said something true to each other without quite saying it. We need a real building, Vivienne said finally. I know. The tent's not going to last the winter. I know that too. She turned around. There's timber on your ridge. Enough for a small structure. She looked at him carefully. I'm not asking you to give it. I'm asking if we could discuss it. He looked at her for a long moment. We can discuss it, he said. She sat back down at the table and opened her notebook. And that was the beginning of the schoolhouse. Autumn. The building went up over 3 Saturdays in late November and early December, which was too late in the season to be sensible and exactly on time to be necessary. It was not a beautiful structure. It was 12 feet by 18 feet, single room, with a plank floor that Gideon leveled himself and walls that were plumb but not polished. Ed Rourke did the framing. A man named Basco, who had been a carpenter back in Ohio and was now a rancher because Ohio had run out of work, did the windows, 2 of them, small, on the south wall to catch the afternoon light. Cutter and Poe did the roofing, which required 2 days of cold, precise work and cost Cutter, a strip of skin off his left palm that he addressed by wrapping a rag around it and continuing. Tom Harmon contributed a door. He appeared one Saturday morning with it loaded in his wagon, a proper door, not just planks on hinges, and when Vivian asked where it had come from, he said he'd had it in the back of the storage room for years and couldn't remember what he'd planned to do with it. This was almost certainly not true, but she accepted it with the grace the moment required. The children were not present during construction. Vivian had made that decision deliberately. She did not want the schoolhouse to be a thing that was happening to them. She wanted it to be a thing they arrived at. On the morning of the first day of school in the new building, she got there early, before the children, before the parents, and stood in the empty room. The floor smelled of fresh-cut pine. The windows let in thin winter light. There was a blackboard, bought from the Territorial Supply Company with money that had come from a collection among 6 families, each contributing what they could. Some a few coins, Clara Rourke, a full $1, Daniel Hendricks $4 in coin that he had clearly been saving for something and had apparently decided this was the something. Vivian stood in the empty room and put her hand flat against the blackboard, feeling its cool surface. She was thinking about the Missouri School Board and their letter. She was thinking about the seminary in Connecticut and the day they'd sold the building while the students were still in it. She was thinking about the Sherman boy, 8 years old, and the brightness of his eyes when the letters started to make sense. She was thinking about all the rooms she'd stood in that other people had taken from her. This one, she told herself, was different. Not because it couldn't be taken. It could, easily, if Houghton and his development company had their way. But because this time, the room wasn't just hers. It was Ed Rourke's and Clara Rourke's and Daniel Hendricks and his daughter Iris and Tom Harmon's misremembered door and Cutter's rag-wrapped hand. It would be harder to take a room that belonged to that many people. She went outside and waited for the children. They came in 1s and 2s and small clusters, materializing out of the cold morning, some of them running the last stretch of road from curiosity. 29 children stood outside the new building and looked at it with wide eyes and various expressions: awe, uncertainty, the particular excitement of children who have been given something they weren't entirely sure was for them. Iris Hendricks was the first one through the door. She walked in slowly, the way you walk into a church, and stood in the middle of the room and looked at the blackboard and the windows and the plank floor. Then she turned around and looked at Vivian. "It's real," she said. "Yes," Vivian said. "It is." Iris nodded once, with great seriousness, and went and sat down. The gathering that had been forming slowly through October and November crystallized, in December, into something that had the structural weight of an actual community. People who had been individually struggling were still individually struggling, but they were doing it in proximity to each other now, which changed the math in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Clara Rourke's preserving arrangement had expanded to include 7 families. The Haverford S. and the Basco family had begun a shared tool arrangement that meant expensive equipment sat idle less often. 2 of the younger ranchers whose land bordered each other's had worked out a fence maintenance agreement that saved both of them a week of labor every season. None of this was organized by Vivian. She had started the thing, but the thing had its own momentum now. What she did organize in early December was a different kind of meeting. She called it, without particular ceremony, a community discussion. She sent word to every family within 10 miles, through the Rourke children, through Iris, through Tom Harmon's counter, where news traveled like water through rock. She chose the schoolhouse, which was the largest private indoor space available. She did not invite Walt Houghton, which was a decision she made without announcing it, and which required a particular kind of nerve because Houghton was the largest landholder in the area, and his absence would be as loud as a statement. 14 families came: Ed Rourke and his wife, the Haverfords, Daniel Hendricks, who left Iris at home and drove in by himself, which told Vivian something about how he was doing. Tom Harmon, who stood in the back with his arms crossed and said very little and clearly intended to vote with his presence. Basco, two homesteader families from the east section who Vivian had never met before, but who had heard about the meeting and come anyway. Gideon sat in the back row. He had not, initially, intended to sit anywhere. He had driven Vivian to the meeting and planned to wait outside with the wagon. She had looked at him and said, "Come inside," without making it optional, and he had come inside. Vivian stood at the blackboard. She wrote 2 words on it: railroad, land. "I've been told," she said without preamble, "that a development company out of Cheyenne is interested in purchasing land in this area, specifically the North Corridor. Their representative was here in October. He's gone back east, but he hasn't gone away." She looked around the room. "You should all know this. It affects everyone in this room." The room was quiet. Then Ed Rourke said, "What kind of development?" "A railroad spur 3 to 5 years out, if the territorial survey goes through." She paused. "That means this land is going to be worth considerably more than it is now, which means a company that gets here first and buys cheap will profit substantially." "How do we know this?" asked one of the homesteaders from the east section, a man named Garvey, solid-built and skeptical-faced. "Because Walt Houghton told Gideon Mercer," Vivian said, "and because the behavior of the land agent Rollins, during the week he spent here, was consistent with someone assessing land for bulk purchase." Garvey looked at Gideon. Gideon nodded once. "So what do we do?" Clara Rourke said. She had the directness of a woman who had already calculated that worry was less useful than action. "We know what's coming," Vivian said. "That's the first thing. Knowledge is not nothing. It's the difference between being caught off guard and being ready." She set down her chalk. "The second thing is that a development company pressures isolated sellers. They approach you one at a time, each of you separately, and they offer you enough that it's hard to say no, and then they move to the next. That's how consolidation works." "So they won't pressure a group," said Daniel Hendricks. He said it quietly, from the side of the room, and people turned to look at him. He was not a man who spoke in public, and the room understood this. "It's harder to pressure a group," Vivian confirmed. "Not impossible, but harder." The conversation that followed was not elegant. It was the messy, circling, occasionally heated conversation of people who are frightened about their futures and trying to work out whether they trust each other enough to do something about it together. Garvey asked hard questions about what exactly a group commitment would look like and who would enforce it. 2 of the homesteader families were clearly interested but non-committal. Tom Harmon, from the back of the room, said exactly 1 sentence. "My family's been in Black Hollow for 11 years, and I'm not selling to a railroad company." The meeting lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, nothing was formally decided. No documents signed, no votes taken. But 12 of the 14 families had said, in various ways and with various degrees of certainty, that they were not interested in selling. Vivian didn't push for more than that. You couldn't get more than that from people who didn't yet trust each other enough to make binding commitments. What you could do was plant the idea that standing together was possible, and let it grow in the cold between now and when it mattered. She cleaned the blackboard after everyone had gone. Gideon was the last one in the room. He was leaning against the back wall with his arms crossed, watching her erase the letters. "You knew Houghton wasn't going to come," he said. "Yes." "Why not invite him and call his bluff?" She turned around. "Because the families in this room needed to talk without worrying about what he'd think. Houghton in the room would have silenced half of them." She set the eraser down. "He'll hear about it. That's fine. Let him hear that 14 families sat in a room together and talked. That's information too." Gideon looked at her. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not quite admiration, which would have been too simple. Something more complicated than that. The look of a man who is being shown something he didn't know was possible and isn't sure yet what to do with it. "Let's go home," he said. She nodded and pulled on her coat. "It's up." December shortened the days to a nub, and the cold settled in permanent and real. The schoolhouse held 29 children most days, sometimes more. Vivian added evening sessions twice a week for adults, parents who had never learned to read properly, or who had learned and lost the habit, or who simply wanted to be part of what was happening in that warm, lamp-lit room with the blackboard and Tom Harmon's second-hand door. Daniel Hendricks came to the Tuesday evening session for 3 weeks before he participated. The fourth week he read aloud from the primer Vivian had given him, slowly and with effort, but without stopping. And when he finished, he looked up and his face was entirely unreadable, the face of a man who has just done something he didn't know he could do. Good, Vivian said, just that, and moved on to the next person. Later, walking to the wagon where Gideon waited, Daniel Hendricks stopped her on the path and said, without looking at her directly, "Iris's mother would have liked you." Vivian said nothing for a moment. "That's a kind thing to say?" "It's true," he said, and walked to his own horse. It was on a Friday evening in mid-December that Gideon found himself doing something he hadn't done in 3 years. He was in the barn, checking on one of the horses that had been favoring her left foreleg, when he heard Vivian in the loft above him, not talking, just moving around, the familiar sounds of her evening routine, the scratch of her pencil across papers, the occasional quiet word to the barn cat. He finished with the horse and stood there for a moment in the quiet below. Then he climbed the loft ladder. She looked up when he appeared at the top. She was sitting on the cot with her knees drawn up and the cat settled against her ankles, papers spread around her in a radius. Her hair was down and her boots were off, and she looked like a person who was temporarily off duty, which was a state he'd rarely seen her in. "Something wrong with the mare?" she asked. "She'll be fine. Probably caught it on the fence." He sat down on the floor near the top of the ladder. Not close, just in the space. He looked around the loft, which she had organized with a thoroughness that still impressed him. Books stacked in a precise order. Her 2 dresses hung on nails with the care of someone who understood that these were the only 2 dresses she had, and they needed to last. A small collection of objects on the crate she used as a table. Her ink bottle, a comb, a folded letter he'd never asked about, and a small river stone, smooth and dark. "What's the stone?" he said. She glanced at it. "From the Connecticut River. I picked it up when I was 17. She paused. "The day I decided I was going to be a teacher." "Why that day?" "I was sitting by the river trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. The stone was just there." She picked it up and turned it in her fingers. "I kept it because decisions made in a specific moment deserve a specific object, something you can hold when you forget what you decided." He thought about that. He looked at his own hands, wide, rough, the hands of a man who had spent 20 years building and fixing and doing. He thought about what object he would have if he were the kind of person who kept such things. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. "All right, the letter." He nodded toward the crate. "You don't have to tell me what's in it, but is it something I should know about, something that affects—" He gestured vaguely, which he knew was inadequate but couldn't quite improve on. Vivian was quiet. She set the stone down and looked at the folded letter without touching it. "It's from my father," she said. He waited. "He's ill." She said it flatly. "Or he says he is. We haven't spoken in 4 years." She paused. "My father is a man of some consequence back east. Industrialist. My mother died when I was 12 and he—" She stopped, started again. "We disagreed about my future. He had plans for it. I had different ones. I left when I was 23 and didn't write for 6 months. And when I did write the letter I received back made it clear that leaving had been, in his view, something that couldn't be walked back." "But he wrote to you." "His lawyers found me. Apparently he's been ill for some time and there are matters requiring my attention." She said matters with a flatness that made it clear she understood exactly what that meant and was not looking forward to it. "Are you going to go?" A long silence. The lamp flickered slightly in a draft from the barn below. "Not yet," she said. "Not while the school is—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I don't know," she said more honestly. "I don't know what I'm going to do." Gideon sat with that. He understood more than she knew the particular weight of being called back to something that had hurt you, the way the past doesn't ask, it just demands. "Whatever you decide," he said carefully, "the school will hold. The people here are sturdy enough now." She looked at him. "I'm not worried about the school," she said quietly. He held her gaze for a moment. The cat shifted against her ankles and settled again. "Me neither," he said, and meant it in a way that both of them understood was not entirely about the school. He stood up. He looked at her once more. at the papers and the stone and the letter and the woman in the lamplight who had, without any particular effort or intention, walked into his life and made it significantly more difficult to be the man he'd decided he was going to be. "Good night, Vivian," he said. "Good night, Gideon." He climbed back down the ladder. Below, the horses moved softly in their stalls. The barn cat's eyes tracked him in the dark, 2 points of cold light. Outside, the snow had started again. He stood in the doorway of the barn for a moment, looking at the house, at the unfinished east wall, barely visible in the dark, the raw timber that had stood untouched for 3 years. He stood there for a long time. Then he went inside and lit the lamp and sat at the kitchen table and thought, really thought, for the first time in 3 years, about what it would take to finish it. The snow that had started on that December night did not stop for 4 days. It was the kind of snow that reshapes a landscape. Not violent, just persistent, covering everything in layers. Thick enough to muffle sound and soften edges until the world looked entirely different from the one you'd known the week before. The north road disappeared under 2 feet of drift. The cattle moved into the lower pastures on instinct, their backs white, their breath making long, slow clouds. The schoolhouse held, which Gideon checked every morning with a thoroughness that had nothing to do with the building and everything to do with habit, the need to verify that the things you'd built were still standing. The blizzard's end revealed something that the snow had been quietly preserving, a set of tracks on the far side of the north fence line. Not cattle tracks, not deer. Boot prints and horse prints, deep pressed into the mud beneath the snow, following the line of the fence northward, with the deliberate direction of someone who knew where they were going. Cutter found them on the morning of the 5th day and said nothing until he and Gideon were alone at the barn. 2 horses, Cutter said. 2 men on foot at some point. They stopped here. He showed Gideon on a rough sketch he'd made on the back of a feed receipt. And here, both spots have a clear view of the south pasture, clear view of the house. Gideon looked at the sketch. When? 3rd night of the snow, maybe 4th. Hard to date precisely, but the prints were under at least 12 inches of accumulation. So they were out in the blizzard. Either that or they got covered after. Either way, they weren't casual. Cutter folded the receipt and put it in his pocket. This isn't a land agent, Gideon. Land agents don't walk fence lines in snowstorms. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He thought about Houghton's careful words on that November afternoon. People who matter to you become people who can be used. He thought about Rollins and his leather satchel and his too-good suit and the way he had looked at the North Road with the patience of someone who was measuring, not visiting. I want someone on watch at night, Gideon said. Rotating, you and Poe. Cutter nodded. Already planned on it. Don't tell anyone else yet. Cutter looked at him. Including Miss Hale? Gideon was quiet for a beat too long. Not yet. Cutter said nothing. He was not a man who editorialized, and his silence now was not disapproval exactly, more the silence of a man who has noted a decision and reserved the right to consider it later. Vivian noticed the change in Gideon anyway. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, not through any single dramatic tell, but through the accumulation of small ones. He was up earlier than usual. He took a different route when he rode the fence line, and he took it with the specific attention of someone who was looking for something rather than simply checking. He and Cutter had conversations that ended when she came within hearing range, not abruptly, just redirected. The way men redirect conversations when they've decided a subject is not ready for a larger audience. She did not press him directly. That wasn't how they worked by now. They had developed, over these months, a grammar of restraint that she respected because it was mutual. But she watched, and she filed things away. And she waited. What she did not expect was that the thing pressing at her own life would surface before he told her anything. The second letter arrived on a Thursday, brought out from town by Tom Harmon's delivery boy, who had no idea what he was carrying and handed it over with the same expression he used for everything, which was a mild desire to be somewhere else. It was not from her father this time. It was from a firm of attorneys in New York, Whitmore, Slade, and Carey, whose letterhead alone communicated the kind of money that had lawyers with matching stationery. The letter was 3 pages, written in the precise, airless language of legal correspondence, and it said in essence the following, that her father, Cornelius Ashcroft, was gravely ill, that the matter of the Ashcroft estate was now an active legal concern, that as his only surviving heir, her presence in New York was not a request but a necessity, and that if she failed to appear within 60 days, certain provisions of her father's will could be interpreted in ways that would be considerably to her disadvantage. She read it twice. Then she folded it very carefully along its existing creases and set it on the crate beside the river stone and looked at both of them for a long time. Ashcroft. She had been Vivian Ashcroft until she was 23 years old, a name that meant something in certain rooms in certain eastern cities, the kind of something that opened doors and closed conversations and required a particular performance of self that she had found, by the end, unbearable. She had set it down like a coat that no longer fit and walked away from it, and she had been, if not at peace with that decision, then at least consistent with it. She had not told Gideon her real name. She had not told anyone in Black Hollow. She sat with that for a while. Then she put on her coat and went to find him. I was in the south pasture checking water troughs when she came across the field toward him, and he knew, from the way she was walking, deliberate, not hurried but not casual, that something had changed. "I need to tell you something," she said when she reached him, "and I need you to let me tell it all the way through before you react." He set down the chisel he'd been using to break the ice on the trough rim. "All right," she told him, "all of it. Not just the letter, but the name, Ashcroft, and what it meant, and who her father was, and why she had left, and the 4 years of silence between them, and the first letter. And now this second one with its 60-day window and its careful legal menace." She told it plainly, without theater, in the voice of someone who has rehearsed the telling enough to keep it from getting away from her. When she finished, Gideon was quiet for longer than she'd expected. The wind moved through the dried grass of the south pasture. One of the horses at the far end of the field raised its head and looked at them and then went back to grazing. "Vivian Ashcroft," he said. "Vivian Hale," she said. "Hale was my mother's name before she married. I kept it." She paused. "I'm not apologizing for that. I needed to be someone that name didn't follow. I'm not asking for an apology." He was looking at her steadily. "Cornelius Ashcroft, the man with the steel foundries. Among other things, yes. You're his heir. I'm his only child." She said it without pride or self-pity, just fact. "Which means the estate, the foundries, the properties, the investments. Everything comes to me when he dies. Or it does if I appear and assert the claim. If I don't—" She paused. "The attorneys would find ways to redirect it. To cousins, to business partners who've been waiting. The letter is a warning dressed as an invitation." Gideon picked up the chisel again and turned it in his hands. "How much are we talking about?" "More than this town will see in 50 years. She said it quietly. "Maybe more than this territory." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze with the composure of someone who had decided, before she walked out here, that she would hold it regardless of what she saw in his eyes. What she saw was harder to read than she'd expected. Not anger, not betrayal, not the particular cold expression of a man who feels deceived. Something more conflicted than any of those. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like a man working out what things mean when everything is shifted 3 inches to the left. "You said 60 days, he said, "from the letter's date. That's about 45 days now. And if you go?" "I handle whatever needs handling, try to protect what's mine." She exhaled. "And then I come back." He looked at her. "You're saying that like it's simple." "It's not simple." She met his eyes. "But it's true." Another silence. The wind picked up and she pulled her coat tighter, and he watched her do it, and then he said, "Why didn't you tell me before?" She had expected the question and had thought about how to answer it honestly. "Because I didn't know if I could trust this place yet," she said, "and then by the time I did—" She stopped. "It seemed like something I'd waited too long on, and I didn't know how to start." "The longer you wait on something like that—" "I know." She looked at him directly. "I know, and I'm telling you now." I was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the frozen trough, at the field, at the schoolhouse visible in the distance. "Does it change anything?" he said, "in terms of what you're planning to do here?" "No," she said. "Not if I have any say in it." "You'll have a say in it," he said. He said it with a certainty that she hadn't asked for and that caught her somewhere below her breastbone. "But those lawyers— 60 days isn't much time to get to New York and handle an estate that size." "I know." "And winter travel." "I know, Gideon." She said it more quietly, not sharply. "I know all of it. I'm not asking you to solve it. I'm asking you to know." He looked at her. Something in his face went through a change that was difficult to follow, like watching weather move across a landscape, the shadow of a cloud over open ground. Then he nodded, once. All right, he said, I know. He turned back to the trough and resumed chiseling the ice. She stood beside him for a moment, not helping, just present. There's something else, he said. She looked at him. He told her about the tracks, about Cutter's sketch, about the watches at night, about the way the whole thing had the feel, to men who recognize such things, of something being organized rather than something opportunistic. She listened with the same focused stillness she always brought to hard information. When he finished, she said, Why didn't you tell me sooner? Same reason you gave me, he said, without looking up from the trough. She absorbed that. Fair, she said. I should have told you earlier. He stopped chiseling. I was trying to manage it. So was I. He looked at her then, and there was something almost wry in it. The recognition between two people who have just discovered they make the same mistakes and find this simultaneously exasperating, and, in some way, neither would admit without provocation, a small relief. January settled over Black Hollow with the full weight of a territory winter, and life contracted to the essential: warmth, feed, survival. The school continued. Vivienne was not going to let a winter close what a community had built. But the attendance became irregular as storms moved through and kept families home. She used the quieter days to write curriculum for the spring term, and to write, on one difficult evening, a letter to the firm of Whitmore, Slade and Carey informing them that she would arrive in New York before the 60 days elapsed. She wrote it at the kitchen table in Gideon's house, which she had been using increasingly over the last weeks as the barn loft proved definitively too cold for evening work. He sat across from her reading a supply catalog, or appearing to read it, and neither of them commented on the fact that they were sharing a kitchen table at 9 at night with a comfortable familiarity that had no particular name and didn't require one. She told him she'd written the letter when she finished it. He looked up from the catalog. When are you leaving? 2 weeks. I'll take the stage east to the rail junction. She folded the letter with the practiced care of someone being very deliberate about something. It'll take me at least a week to reach New York. Maybe longer in winter conditions. How long will you need once you're there? I don't know. Weeks. Maybe longer, depending on what the estate situation looks like. She set the letter down flat on the table. My father may not be alive when I arrive. He said nothing. The lamp made the kitchen warm and close. I'll leave the curriculum with Clara Rourke, Vivienne said. She can manage the basics. Margaret Haverford is a capable enough reader to cover the primer lessons. She was organizing it out loud, the way she organized everything, in lists, in sequence, in the steady forward motion of someone who needed to keep moving or risk stopping entirely. The evening sessions will have to pause. I'll write instructions. Vivienne. He said it quietly, but with enough weight that she stopped. She looked at him. The school will manage, he said. We'll manage. A pause. I'm asking about you. She was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of pause that happens when someone says the thing you were bracing against, and it turns out to be softer than you expected. I don't know, she said honestly. I haven't been in the same room as my father in 4 years. I don't know what I'll find or how I'll feel about it. She looked at the folded letter. I know what I'm going back to. It's a world where everything is money and position and the question of who controls what. It's a world where women like me are assets to be allocated. Her voice was even, but something underneath it was not. It's a world that tried very hard, for a long time. And you're going back to it. I'm going back to settle it. She looked at him steadily. There's a difference. If I don't go, those lawyers will decide what happens to my father's estate, and whoever they're working for will get what they want. And then that money, all of it, goes towards something that has nothing to do with schools in frontier towns. She paused. I'm going back so I can come back here. The distinction hung in the air between them. "I'll make sure the stage gets you safely to the junction," he said. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." He turned back to the catalog and then set it down. "I'll drive you myself." She looked at him for a moment. The lamp between them made the shadows soft. "All right," she said. The night before she left, neither of them slept much. Gideon knew this about himself. He was awake past midnight, lying on his back in the dark, listening to the wind and the sound of the house settling in the cold. He wasn't thinking in any organized way. He was doing what people do when they're trying not to think about something specific by thinking about everything else. And it was about as effective as it usually is. He thought about the tracks on the north fence line, which Cutter had found 2 more sets of in the weeks since the blizzard. Always at night. Always watching the south pasture. He had not yet spoken to the other ranchers about this, had been waiting for something more concrete, some clear direction or affiliation, before he alarmed people unnecessarily. But the watches continued, and the winter silence had a quality he didn't trust. He thought about Houghton, who had been absent from the Saturday gatherings, and who had neither confirmed nor denied anything about the Rollins offer. Houghton's silence was a kind of speech. Gideon had been around long enough to know that men like Walt made their decisions in winter and executed them in spring. He thought about the east wall, the unfinished room, the cold that came through it even with the boards nailed across, a cold that lived in the house like a permanent resident, inhabiting the space that should have been walls and glass and plaster and a window facing east. He thought, finally and inevitably, about Vivian. I thought about the particular way she had of going still when she was thinking hard, like a body of water when the wind stops. He thought about the river stone on the crate and the things she'd said about decisions made in specific moments. He thought about her standing in the empty schoolhouse. The morning it opened, her hand flat against the new blackboard, her back to the room, and the way she turned around when the children came through the door with an expression he'd only glimpsed for a second before she composed it. An expression of pure, undefended relief. I was in very significant trouble, and he knew it, and it was too late to do anything about it, which was perhaps the most honest assessment he'd made of himself in 3 years. At some point before dawn, he fell asleep. She was ready at first light. She had 1 trunk, the same trunk she'd arrived with, and her carpet bag, and the carpet bag had the river stone in it, which he noticed when he loaded the trunk into the wagon, and she double-checked the bag's contents with a thoroughness that was about something other than packing. Cutter and Poe were up. They said goodbye to Vivian in the quiet way of men who are not given to ceremony. Cutter with a nod, and something that was almost but not quite a handshake. Poe with a single "safe travels, ma'am," that contained considerably more than those 3 words. Iris Hendricks had come with her father. Daniel hadn't said how he'd known the departure time. But he was there, and Iris walked directly to Vivian and stood in front of her with the particular expression of a child who is working very hard not to cry. "I'll keep up with the lessons," Iris said. "I know you will." Vivian crouched down in the cold to be level with her. "Mrs. Rourke has the books. You read the Dickens before anyone else gets to it." "How long will you be gone?" A pause. "I don't know exactly, but I'm coming back." Iris looked at her with those watchful eyes that had seen too much too young. "Promise?" Vivian didn't answer immediately, which was its own kind of answer, the answer of someone who doesn't make promises they're not sure they can keep. "I'm coming back," she said. "That's the truest thing I can tell you." Iris nodded. Then she did the same quick, slightly awkward hug she'd done on the homestead porch months ago and retreated to her father's side. Daniel Hendricks met Vivian's eyes and nodded once. That was everything he had, and it was enough. They drove the 3 miles to the stage depot without much talk. The morning was bitterly cold. The sky, the particular white of a winter sky that can't decide between cloud and clear, and their breath made continuous small clouds between them on the wagon seat. At the depot, Gideon loaded her trunk into the stage boot while the driver checked the harness, and the other 2 passengers, a traveling merchant and an older woman heading east to family, took their seats inside. Vivian stood at the stage door. She had her carpet bag, and she'd put on a better coat than the one she'd arrived in. Clara Rourke had insisted on lending her one, heavier wool, more suited to the journey. And she looked, standing there in the cold morning light, like a woman who was doing something that cost her something, which is different from a woman who is frightened. Gideon stood in front of her. He wanted to say several things. He was aware of all of them, queued up behind his teeth like a train that couldn't find clearance. He looked at her and she looked back at him, and neither of them said any of the things that were most true. What he said was, "Right when you get to the junction." "I will." "The community discussion was your idea. They'll hold it together because you put it together right." He paused. "But come back." She looked at him steadily, her dark eyes in the cold light. "I will," she said, and meant it in this way that people mean the most important things. Not casually, not as comfort, but as a statement of intent that costs something to make. He nodded. She climbed into the stage. The driver released the brake and the stage rolled forward, wheels crunching on the frozen road. Gideon watched it move down the main street of Black Hollow, past Harmon's store and the saloon and the church with its ropeless bell, and then around the bend where the road curved east, and then it was gone. He stood at the empty depot platform for a moment in the cold. Then he got in his wagon and drove back to the ranch. The problem with absence, Gideon discovered over the following weeks, was not that it was empty. It was that it had a shape. Vivian's absence had the exact shape of Vivian. Her place at the kitchen table in the evening, her lamp in the barn loft, the sound of her moving around in the early mornings before he was up, the 29 children in the schoolhouse who asked, with the unself-conscious directness of children, when she was coming back. He didn't have a good answer for them. Clara Rourke ran the school with competent, no-nonsense efficiency. The children learned. The lessons continued. The Saturday gatherings continued, though they had a slightly different quality without Vivian. More comfortable in some ways. The ease of people who knew each other well now, but missing whatever it was she provided that was harder to name than organization. Gideon threw himself into work. Winter work on a ranch is not glamorous. It is the stubborn, cold, repetitive labor of keeping things alive, which is not nothing but is also not distracting enough when you need distraction. He repaired fence sections that didn't strictly need repairing. He reorganized the barn in a way that Cutter observed with the mild expression of someone watching a man rearrange furniture because he can't sleep. He received her first letter 10 days after she left. It was brief. She'd made the junction. She was boarding the eastbound train. The journey had been rough but manageable. No word about what she'd find in New York. The handwriting was neat, controlled, the penmanship of someone who had been taught carefully. He read it 3 times and put it in his coat pocket and went out to fix another section of fence. The second letter came 3 weeks later and was longer. "My father is alive but not well. The estate is more complicated than the lawyers indicated. There are debts and business entanglements and interests I had not known about. The attorneys are not all working in my favor. There is a man named Hargrove, a business partner of my father's, who has been managing certain assets with an informality that is either incompetence or deliberate, and I have not yet determined which. My father and I have spoken twice. It is difficult. He's not the man I remember, which should make things easier and somehow makes them harder. The city is very loud. I had forgotten how loud. There is a quality of silence in the territory that I find myself missing more than I expected. How is the mare's leg?" Gideon sat at the kitchen table and wrote back for the first time in his life to someone other than a business contact. He told her the mare was fine. He told her that Iris Hendricks had finished the Dickens and had started on something else. He told her that the schoolhouse roof had held through January's worst storm and that Cutter had found a 4th set of fence line tracks in the north section and that he was watching the situation carefully. He told her that the Saturday gatherings were still happening. He did not tell her that he had stood in front of the unfinished room's door 2 nights ago with a hammer in his hand and had not quite been able to begin. He mailed the letter on his next supply run and drove back in the cold and sat on the porch steps in his coat and looked at the east side of the house in the failing afternoon light and thought about time and what it actually does and doesn't do. It was Poe who saw them first. He came in from the night watch in the last week of January with his face set in the particular expression of a man who has encountered something he needs to report but hasn't decided how urgently. 6 horses, he said, when he and Gideon were alone. Moving through the north section in the dark. Not in a line, spread out like they were covering ground. Did they see you? Wouldn't be standing here if they had. Poe pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands. These aren't land agents, Gideon. Land agents don't ride in the dark in 6-man formations. Gideon had known this for some time in the way you know things you're not ready to act on yet. He sat with the information for a moment. Did you see any markings? Brands? Horses weren't branded that I could see. Rider gear was good, not cheap. He paused. One of them had a rifle across his saddle, long barrel. All right, Gideon said. All right, meaning what? Meaning I need to talk to the other ranchers. He stood up. Tomorrow. All of them that can come. Poe nodded. He put his hat back on. Want me to send word? Go yourself. Rourke first, then Haverford. Tell them it's not an emergency, but it can't wait. Poe left in the early morning dark. Gideon sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on its surface, looking at the wall, thinking about the shape of the problem. A land development company sends a polished agent to assess the territory. The agent finds what he's looking for: weak, isolated ranchers, dry land, a dying town. He goes back and reports. The company has options. They can wait for financial pressure to make the ranchers willing, or they can create the pressure themselves. They can move on Houghton to anchor their position, or they can move around him. They can buy compliance, or they can frighten people into it. The 6 riders in the dark were not Rollins and his leather satchel. They were the second option. 8 men gathered in Gideon's barn 2 days later. Ed Rourke, Tom Haverford and his older brother James, Daniel Hendricks, Basco, Garvey, the skeptical homesteader from the community meeting. 2 men from the east section Gideon knew by sight and not well by name. Cutter and Poe stood at the barn door, not quite inside the meeting, which was a distinction that communicated something without anyone having to say it. Gideon told them plainly what he knew: the tracks, the riders, the pattern of it, the land agent first, then the watchers, then organized men on horseback. He told them about Rollins and the development company and the railroad corridor. The barn was quiet when he finished. One of the horses shifted in its stall. Rustlers, Ed Rourke said. Not a question. Organized, Gideon said. Not a couple of desperate men. This is planned. What do they want? James Haverford asked. He was a careful man, James, measured, not quick to alarm but not slow to think either. They want the land cheap, Gideon said. Scared ranchers sell cheap. Ranchers who've had their cattle run off or their buildings burned sell cheaper. He paused. That's the pattern. I've seen it work twice in the territory. It won't work here if we don't let it. What does not letting it look like? Asked Garvey. It looks like this, Gideon said. He gestured at the barn, at the 8 men in it. It looks like knowing what's coming before it arrives. It looks like not being isolated when it does. He looked around at them. I need to know which of you are in and which of you aren't. No judgment either way. But I need to know. Another silence. Daniel Hendricks said, in. Ed Rourke said, in. What do you need from us? The others came in one by one, Garvey last, with the expression of a man who has weighed something and found the weight sufficient. In, he said, but I want a plan, not just intentions. You'll have one, Gideon said. He spent the next hour laying out what he knew and what he proposed, and the men in the barn listened and pushed back and asked hard questions, and gradually a thing that was not exactly a plan, but was the beginning of one took shape in the cold air of the barn. When they left, Cutter came inside and stood with Gideon in the empty barn. Vivian started this, Cutter said. Gideon looked at him. The gathering, the trust. He shrugged slightly. Wouldn't have 8 men in your barn if she hadn't spent the fall building something worth showing up for. Gideon said nothing. He looked at the space where the men had been standing. When's she coming back? Cutter asked. When she can, Gideon said. He walked to the barn door and looked out at the house, the east wall, the raw timber, the boarded window that had never let in a sunrise. Somewhere east of here, across the miles of winter territory and the rail lines and the cold plains, Vivian Hale was sitting in a room in New York with lawyers and a dying father and the weight of a name she'd set down years ago. She was handling it the way she handled everything, with her chin level and her eyes open and a particular quiet fury that didn't announce itself. He thought about what she'd said. I'm going back so I can come back here. He thought about 8 men in his barn who had shown up because someone had built something worth showing up for. He went inside and put the kettle on and sat at the kitchen table and took out her last letter and read it again, slowly, the way you read things that matter. The lamp burned low. The house settled in the cold. Outside, Cutter began the first night watch of what was now, quietly and without ceremony, a vigil. The trouble was coming. Gideon had been around long enough to know the difference between the silence before a storm and ordinary quiet, and this silence was the first kind. He was, for the first time in 3 years, not afraid of it. That surprised him. He sat with it for a while, trying to understand it, and then he understood. The difference was not in the storm. The difference was that he was no longer standing alone on the ground waiting for it to arrive. He folded Vivian's letter, put it in his coat pocket with the others, and went to bed. He slept until the first gray light of morning, the best he'd slept in weeks, and rose and put the coffee on and stood at the kitchen window watching the dawn come up cold and clear over the east ridgeline. Then he went to the barn, and for the first time since he'd put them there, he took the hammer and the box of nails down from the shelf where they'd been sitting for 3 years. He stood at the door of the unfinished room for a long moment. Then he walked away, put them back, and went to feed the horses. He wasn't ready, but he knew now that he would be. That was different from anything he'd felt in a very long time, and he held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you found unexpectedly, something you're not sure yet what to do with, but certain enough about to not put back down. February came in mean and stayed that way. The cold had a different quality now. Not the clean, dry cold of January, but something wetter and more relentless. A cold that got into the wood of the buildings, and the joints of men who'd been working outside too long, and the disposition of animals that had been barn confined for weeks. The horses were restless. The cattle moved poorly. And the men on night watch came in each morning with red faces and that particular tightness around the eyes of people who have been looking into darkness for too long. Gideon received Vivian's third letter on a Tuesday. It was the longest she'd written, 6 pages, the handwriting slightly less controlled than usual in places. The writing of someone who'd been at it late, or under pressure, or both. My father died on the 14th. I was present. We had spoken 3 times in total, which was less than I'd hoped and more than I'd expected. And I won't tell you that we resolved everything between us because we didn't. Some things don't resolve. They just end, and you carry what's left. The estate situation is more serious than I anticipated. Hargrove, my father's business partner, has been positioning himself for over a year. He has allies among the attorneys and among the board of the foundry company, and he moved quickly after my father's death in ways that were clearly prepared in advance. He is not a stupid man. He is the kind of man who mistakes ruthlessness for intelligence, which makes him dangerous but also predictable. I have retained my own counsel, a woman named Dora Claiborne, who was recommended to me by a colleague of my father's who appears to be one of the few honest men in this situation. Dora is not what the firms of Whitmore and Slade expected, which means she is exactly what I need. I do not know yet how long this will take. I want you to know that every day I am in this city, I am aware of what I'm away from. That awareness is, at the moment, the thing keeping me working when I'd rather stop. Tell me about the schoolhouse. Tell me about Iris. Tell me something true about Black Hollow that has nothing to do with lawyers. He sat at the kitchen table and read it twice, then a third time, slowly, the way he'd read her others. Then he turned the pages over and took out his pen and wrote back immediately, which was not something he'd done with the previous letters. He'd waited days each time, composing and recomposing in his head before committing anything to paper. This time he wrote without that. He told her about the schoolhouse, that the children had memorized a poem Clara Rourke had taught them, and had recited it for the Saturday gathering with varying degrees of success and a great deal of collective pride. He told her that Iris had written a composition about the creek, what it looked like in summer, from memory, since she'd never seen it full, and that it was the best piece of student writing he'd read, which he admitted was not a large sample, but he stood by it. He told her about Daniel Hendricks, who had started showing up on Saturday mornings, not just to drop Iris off, but to stay, and who had last week helped Ed Rourke repair the schoolhouse's south windowsill without being asked. He told her, near the end of the letter, that the situation with the riders had developed and that he was handling it, but that she should know. He did not tell her to hurry back. He understood from her letter that she was in a fight of her own and that she was fighting it with everything she had, and telling her to hurry would be a diminishment of that. He trusted her to come back when she could come back. He mailed the letter and drove home in the cold and went directly to check on Cutter, who had been on watch since before dawn. The attack they'd been anticipating came not at night but at first light on a Saturday morning in late February, which was either a miscalculation on someone's part or a deliberate choice to catch people dispersed and unprepared rather than consolidated and watchful. It came from the north. Cutter heard them first. The sound of horses moving fast on the frozen ground, a sound that carries differently than anything else at that hour, a concussion in the earth rather than just in the air. He was at the north fence line and he fired his rifle once into the sky, the signal they'd agreed on, and then rode hard for the ranch. Gideon was up and out of the house before the echo of the shot died. There were 7 of them. They came over the ridge in the gray pre-dawn light strung out across the pasture, riding without urgency now that they'd been spotted, because they'd apparently decided that speed was no longer the point. They had torches, 2 of them, carried by the riders on the outside flanks. The intention was clear enough: fire, fear, the kind of destruction that doesn't require killing anyone to accomplish its purpose. What they had not accounted for was that it was a Saturday morning. The Saturday gatherings had been happening for 4 months. The families who participated had gotten into the habit of arriving early. Ed Rourke's family was already on the road by the time Cutter's shot sounded, close enough that Ed heard it and understood it immediately. The Haverfords were 20 minutes behind them. Daniel Hendricks, who had been driving Iris in for the morning session, pulled his wagon to a stop on the road and listened, and then tied the horse to a fence post and told Iris to stay in the wagon and walked the rest of the way at a pace that was not quite running. Gideon came out of the house with his rifle and was joined inside of 3 minutes by Cutter and Poe. By the time the 7 riders had crossed the pasture and come within 100 yards of the barn, they found not 1 man but 4, positioned at the barn doors and the fence line, with rifles. The riders stopped. This was the moment that decided things. Not the confrontation that followed, not the words exchanged. This moment, when 7 men with torches pulled up short because the target had not remained a target. The one at the front, a broad-shouldered man in a dark coat with a flat-brimmed hat, looked at the 4 rifles and then looked at Gideon. "Mercer," he said. He had a voice like gravel moving in a tin bucket. "You're on my land," Gideon said. He kept his voice even. He'd discovered, in the few minutes between hearing Cutter's shot and reaching the barn, that he was not afraid, which was useful. Not brave, exactly. Just not afraid. There was a difference, and it mattered. "Not for long," the man said. "Put the torches out." Gideon's voice hadn't changed register at all. "You're not burning anything here today. You can ride out the way you came, or you can wait and explain yourselves to the men coming up the road behind you." The broad-shouldered man looked over his shoulder. Ed Rourke's wagon was visible on the road, pulling up. Behind it, another one, Haverford, by the look of the team. The 7 riders exchanged looks. The calculation was visible even at distance, the quick reassessment of a situation that was no longer what they'd planned for. "This isn't finished," the man in the dark coat said. "It is for today," Gideon said. "Ride out." 2 of the riders were already turning their horses. The broad-shouldered man held for another moment, long enough to make clear that he was leaving by choice and not by compulsion, which was a distinction that mattered to him, and then turned and rode north with the others behind him. Gideon watched them go over the ridge and disappear. Cutter lowered his rifle. Poe exhaled through his teeth. Ed Rourke pulled his wagon up to the fence and climbed down. He looked at the direction the riders had gone, and then at the 4 men at the barn, and then at Gideon. "We missed it," Ed said. "You were here," Gideon said. That's what mattered. They met in the schoolhouse an hour later. 10 men, plus Clara Rourke, who had come with Ed and had no intention of waiting outside while decisions were being made, and who communicated this by simply walking through the door and sitting down in the front row where the children usually sat, which silenced any potential objection before it formed. Daniel Hendricks had sent Iris to stay with the Rourke children, and had come to the meeting with a stillness about him that was not the stillness of a man who was afraid, but of a man who had decided something. Gideon told them what had happened plainly, without embellishment. 7 riders, torches, turned back. "They'll come back," James Haverford said. "Yes," Gideon agreed, "with more." "Probably. So what do we do?" Garvey asked. He said it without the skepticism he'd had in the barn meeting back in January, the question of a man who was in and wanted the next direction. Gideon looked around the room, at the blackboard still covered in Vivian's careful handwriting, a mathematics lesson, fractions, the numbers precise and clear, at the children's drawings pinned to the wall above the windowsill, at Tom Harmon's second-hand door. "We send for the territorial marshal," he said. "We've got enough now. Tracks, witnesses, an attempted attack at dawn. That's not just a suspicion anymore, it's a case." "That takes time," Ed Rourke said. "Marshal's office is 3 days away in good conditions." "I know. Which means we keep the watch going until he arrives." He looked at Cutter, who nodded. "I need 2 men per night rotation instead of 1. I need the families who are most exposed on the north side, he looked at Garvey, to consider staying closer to town temporarily. I'm not leaving my land, Garvey said immediately. I'm not asking you to leave it permanently. A week, maybe 2. Garvey's jaw worked. He looked at the floor. A week, he said. There's one more thing, Gideon said. He paused, because this part required a different kind of conversation. Walt Houghton. The room went quiet. Houghton's been working with the development company, Gideon said. I don't know how far in he is. He may have told them about our community meeting. He may have helped them plan the timing. He let that sit. Or he may have gotten in over his head and not realized what kind of company he was keeping. Does it matter which? James Haverford asked. It matters for what we do next, Gideon said. If Houghton's fully committed, he's an enemy. If he's not, he paused. He's still the largest landholder in the area. If the marshal comes and Houghton's standing with these men, that's one situation. If he's standing with us, it's a very different one. Clara Rourke spoke from the front row. Who's going to talk to Walt Houghton? Everyone looked at Gideon. I am, he said. He rode to Houghton's property that afternoon, alone, which Cutter considered a poor decision and said so with his characteristic economy of words. That's a poor decision. I know, Gideon said. Stay here. Houghton's ranch was 3 times the size of Gideon's and looked it. A proper house, 2-story, with a porch that ran the full length of the front. 3 hands visible in the yard, watching Gideon ride in with the neutral assessment of men who have been told to watch. Houghton came out onto the porch before Gideon had fully stopped his horse. He was a big man, Houghton, wide through the shoulders, with a face that had been handsome once and had settled into authority. He looked at Gideon the way a man looks at something he'd been expecting. Mercer. This morning happened, Gideon said without preamble. He didn't get down from his horse. 7 men with torches on my land at dawn. I want to know if you knew about it. Something moved across Houghton's face. Not guilt exactly. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who has agreed to a thing and is now watching its consequences and finding they don't look the way he was told they would. I didn't know about torches, Houghton said. But you knew about the men. A pause. Long enough to be its own answer. Rollins told me it would be pressure, Houghton said. Business pressure. Not... He stopped. Not arson, Gideon said. Houghton's jaw tightened. He looked past Gideon at the middle distance, and in that moment he looked less like the large, consequential man he'd always presented himself as, and more like someone who had made a calculation that had gone wrong and was working out the cost. What do you want, Mercer? I want to know where you stand, Gideon said. Not in 3 days. Right now. Another silence. One of the hands in the yard had drifted slightly closer. Gideon noticed but didn't acknowledge it. I signed a letter of intent with Rollins's company, Houghton said. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Can it be rescinded? Houghton looked at him sharply. Why would I? Because a letter of intent is not a sale, Gideon said. And because the men you're associated with just tried to burn down a schoolhouse in front of 8 witnesses on a Saturday morning. He kept his voice level. The territorial marshal is being notified today. When he arrives, the question of who was working with this company is going to be a question with legal consequences. He paused. You can be on one side of that question or the other. That's what I came to tell you. Houghton was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his yard, at his land, at the ridgeline in the distance. You're asking me to stand against the company, he said. I'm asking you to stand for the people who've been here as long as you have. Gideon gathered his reins. The Rourkes have been in this valley 11 years, Haverford 12. Tom Harmon's family built the first permanent store in Black Hollow. He looked at Houghton steadily. You were here before any of them. You know what this place is and what those men want to turn it into. He turned his horse without waiting for an answer and rode back down the road. He didn't look back. He didn't know what Houghton would decide, and he couldn't afford to spend energy on what he couldn't control. But he'd said the true thing, which was all he'd come to do. The marshal's name was Cord, and he arrived on the 5th day after Gideon's letter, which was faster than anyone had expected and meant he'd ridden in winter conditions that were not pleasant. He was a lean, quiet man in his 50s, with a deputy who was perhaps 20 and trying very hard to project competence, and he listened to Gideon's account of the tracks, the night riders, and the dawn attack with the focused attention of a man who has heard similar accounts before and knows how to hear them. The man in the black coat, Cord said, Describe him again. Gideon did. Cord looked at his deputy, who wrote something down. We've had reports from 2 other territories, Cord said. Same pattern. Land agent first, then harassment, then organized force. He looked at the notes in his hand. This company operates out of Cheyenne in name. Who they actually answer to is something I've been working on for 4 months. You knew about them, Gideon said. I knew they were moving west. Didn't know where they'd land next. He folded the notes. You've done better work than you might know by documenting this. I need your witnesses on paper, every man who was present Saturday morning. You'll have them. Cord nodded. He looked around the ranch, at the barn, the house, the schoolhouse, visible in the south field. That the school? He said. That's what they wanted to burn, Gideon said. The marshal looked at it for a moment. We'll need to move quickly, he said. If their first attempt failed, they'll reorganize. Could be days. I know. Can your people hold another week? Gideon thought about Ed Rourke and Clara and James Haverford and Daniel Hendricks and Garvey and Tom Harmon's second-hand door. He thought about 29 children and the poem they'd memorized and the composition Iris had written about a creek she'd never seen full. They'll hold, he said. The second attempt came 3 nights later, and this time there were more of them. Cutter counted 9 horses on the north ridge before he fired the signal shot, and the sound of them coming down the slope was different from the first time. Faster, less concerned with being heard. The sound of men who had been embarrassed once and were not planning on a second failure. But this time the response was different too. Ed Rourke had been staying at the schoolhouse with his 2 oldest sons and James Haverford since the marshal's arrival, a precaution that had seemed excessive and now did not. Garvey had brought his brother. Daniel Hendricks had driven in at dusk without being asked, and said nothing to anyone and simply taken a position at the south fence line with a rifle across his knees. When the 9 riders came off the ridge and found the south field lit by 4 lanterns, hung from the schoolhouse eaves, casting a wide, flat light across the ground, and 12 armed men at the fence line, they pulled up hard. Marshal Cord stepped forward from the barn door into the light. Federal officer, he said, loudly and clearly, drop your weapons and dismount. What followed was not clean or orderly or anything like what happened in the stories people told later. 2 of the 9 riders turned immediately and rode north without looking back. 3 more exchanged a fast look and then followed. The remaining 4, including the broad-shouldered man in the dark coat, made a decision that was the wrong one, and in the chaos that followed, 40 seconds of noise and confusion, and the cold air full of shouting, and the marshal's deputy shouting something from the other side of the barn. 3 of them were unhorsed, and 1 was struck by a rifle butt wielded by Ed Rourke, who would be slightly embarrassed about the enthusiasm of this action at later retellings, but not deeply. The broad-shouldered man in the dark coat was the last one standing. He looked at Marshal Cord with the expression of a man who has just watched his plan reduce itself to 4 people in a very cold field. Name, Cord said. He gave it. Cord wrote it down with the calm of someone crossing something off a list. It took another hour to secure them and another day to learn, through the captured men's eventual and reluctant cooperation, the shape of the operation, the company, the investors, the arrangement with Rollins, and the exact nature of Houghton's involvement, which turned out to be more limited than Gideon had feared. Houghton had signed a letter of intent and provided information about the territory. He had not sanctioned violence, and he had not known about the riders until Gideon's visit. Whether this made him innocent was a question the marshal considered carefully and then set aside. Noting that letter of intent or not, Houghton had provided material assistance. Houghton arrived at Gideon's ranch the morning after the arrest. He came alone, without his hands, and he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and said to Gideon, I've sent a letter to the company rescinding the intent agreement. He paused. And I've sent a statement to the marshal's office about Rollins and what he told me. Gideon looked at him for a long moment. All right, he said. That's it? Houghton said. What else do you want from me, Walt? Houghton looked at the schoolhouse. He stood there for a moment. She built something real, he said. Not a question. Yes, Gideon said. Houghton nodded once, put his hat back on, and rode home. They never became friends. That was not a story that ended in warmth, but they became, over the following months, the kind of neighbors who nodded on the road and kept their fences where they belonged and had a tacit understanding that the antagonism had cost enough and neither of them wanted to pay more. That was sufficient. In the days after the arrest, while Marshal Cord and his deputy dealt with the considerable paperwork of what had happened, the community of Black Hollow did what communities do when the thing they feared has passed. They gathered. It was not an organized gathering. People simply appeared at the schoolhouse on the Saturday after, the way they always had. Except this time, there were more of them, and they stayed longer. Families that Gideon had never seen at the Saturday gatherings came because word had traveled the way word travels in territory communities, fast and thorough, reaching every homestead and farm within 20 miles. They came to see that the schoolhouse was standing. They came because standing together had worked, which was a thing that needed to be witnessed, not just told. Clara Rourke brought enough food for 3 times the people she expected. This turned out to be exactly right. Gideon sat on the fence at the south end of the field and watched it. He wasn't in the middle of it. That wasn't his instinct, and it never had been. But he could see it from where he sat, and what he saw was something that had not existed when Vivian Hale arrived in Black Hollow with 1 trunk and a carpet bag and a battered notebook full of lists. He thought about her letter. Every day I am in this city, I am aware of what I'm away from. He thought about her saying, in the cold of the barn loft on a December night, I'm going back so I can come back here. He thought about what he was going to say to her when she did. He hadn't worked that out. He was not, by nature, a man who prepared speeches. He said things when he had them and stayed quiet when he didn't, and most of the important things he'd ever communicated had not been said in words at all. But this was different. Some things needed to be said clearly, in plain language, with the person standing in front of you and the possibility of being misunderstood too costly to leave to inference. Daniel Hendricks sat down on the fence beside him without being invited, which was so uncharacteristic of him that Gideon glanced over. Strange couple of weeks, Daniel said. That's one way to put it. They sat there for a while. Iris was in the middle of the gathering, talking to one of the Rourke children with the animation of someone who has news and is enjoying the delivery of it. She'd grown, Gideon thought, not physically. She was still small, still 11 years old, but in the way she moved through the world. The watchfulness was still there, but it had company now. Something adjacent to confidence, or at least to the belief that confidence was possible. I was thinking, Daniel said, staring out at the field, about the creek. What about it? It's been 3 dry summers, but it came back after the drought of '79, I remember it. He paused. I was 16. Looked like it would never come back, and then one spring it did. Gideon looked at him. Iris wrote about it, Daniel said. What it looked like when it was full. She never saw it full. He was quiet for a moment. I described it to her once, early on, when she was small. Must have stuck. He paused again. That's what that school did, Gideon. It gave her somewhere to put the things I told her. Gideon said nothing. He looked at Iris across the field, gesturing enthusiastically about something to the Rourke girl. When's Miss Hale coming back? Daniel asked. When she can, Gideon said. Then, after a moment, I hope soon. Daniel nodded. He climbed down from the fence and went back toward the gathering without further comment. Gideon sat where he was for a while longer. The afternoon light was changing. Still winter light, flat and pale, but longer now than it had been in December, the days beginning their slow extension toward spring. The field was full of people and sound, and the schoolhouse stood in the middle of it all, with Tom Harmon's second-hand door and Basco's careful windows, and the blackboard still marked with Vivian's fractions. He climbed down from the fence and walked back toward the house. He went inside. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, then walked to the door of the unfinished room and opened it. He stood there looking at the raw timber walls, the dirt floor, the 2 boards nailed across where the window should be. He stood there long enough that the cold coming through the unfinished wall raised the hair on his arms. Then he went to the barn and got the hammer and the box of nails and came back. He pried the boards off the window frame carefully, setting them to the side. Cold air pushed through the opening. He looked out through the empty frame at the east pasture, at the ridge beyond it, at the sky above the ridge where the afternoon light was beginning to go gold. Eleanor had wanted it to face east, so she could see the sunrise. He stood at the empty window frame for a long moment. The cold came through steady and clean. Then he took a breath and began to work. He didn't finish it that afternoon. He wasn't going to finish it in a day. That wasn't how the work went, and he knew it. But he made a start, which was something he hadn't been able to do in 3 years, and a start was not nothing. A start was, in fact, the precise thing that had been missing. Outside, across the field, the gathering went on. He could hear it through the empty window frame. Voices, children, the sound of a community that had decided what it was and had defended that decision and was now living inside it, which is the hardest and most necessary thing any collection of people can do. He worked until the light failed, and then a little longer until he couldn't see the nails clearly anymore. Then he put the hammer down and stood in the unfinished room in the dark and listened to the last sounds of people heading home across the field, wagon wheels on frozen ground, voices calling goodbye in the cold air. It was quiet when they were gone. But it was not the old quiet, the kind that had weight and no sound. It was the quiet of a house that was waiting for something. The quiet of a room that was being finished. The quiet of a man who had put down grief long enough to pick up a hammer, which was not the end of anything, but was, unmistakably, the beginning. Spring came to Black Hollow, the way it always did in high country, reluctantly, in fits and starts, 3 warm days followed by a cold snap that made everyone feel foolish for having put away their heavy coats. The creek was still dry, but the soil in the lower pastures had a different smell now, the smell of ground that was thinking about thawing, and the cottonwood tree at the south edge of Gideon's property had begun the slow business of budding, small tight knobs of green along every branch that had been bare and gray for 4 months. Gideon noticed the buds on a Monday morning in March while he was walking the fence line, which he still did every morning out of habit, though the quality of those walks had changed since February. They were no longer surveillance. They were just walks. A man on his own land in the early light, checking that the things he'd built were still standing. There is a difference between those two activities, and the difference matters to the person doing them. He had been working on the East Room through February and into March. Not every day, and not quickly. The work of finishing a room that had stood open for 3 years is not just physical, it turns out. There is a particular kind of stopping and starting involved in work that has grief tangled up in it. Moments where you put the tool down, not because you're tired, but because something surfaces that requires sitting with before you can proceed. I was learning to sit with those moments rather than walk away from them, which was harder and more worthwhile than he could have anticipated. The east wall was plastered now. The window was in, a proper 4-pane window, ordered from the Territorial Supply Company and installed with considerable cursing and 2 trips up the ladder before the frame sat true. Basco had come over one Saturday and helped without being asked, in the quiet way that Basco did most things, and the 2 men had worked through the afternoon without much conversation, and at the end of it the window was level and sealed, and Basco had said, "Good window," and gone home. The floor was still dirt. That was the next thing. But Gideon had learned, over these weeks, not to push the work faster than it wanted to go. The last letter from Vivian had arrived 10 days ago, and it was different from the others. The estate is settled. Hargrove contested twice and lost twice, which Dora Claiborne found professionally satisfying in a way she was too dignified to express directly, but which was apparent in her letter. I have control of the foundry shares and the property holdings. I have also, in the process, discovered that my father made a number of decisions in his final years that were motivated by something other than what I assumed, which does not undo the previous 20 years but complicates the story I'd been telling myself about him. I find I don't know what to do with that yet, so I'm putting it away for now and trusting that I'll know later. I am coming home. 2 weeks, perhaps 3. The journey in March should be more manageable than January was. I'll send word from the junction. She had written home. He had read the letter 4 times before he noticed it, and then sat with it for a long time after. He had not written back. There was nothing he needed to say in a letter that required a letter. Some things need a person in the room. The word from the junction came on a Wednesday. A telegram, which Gideon received from Tom Harmon's counter with the studied casualness of a man who had definitely not been checking for it every supply run for the past 2 weeks. Arriving Friday on the morning stage. VH. He read it twice, folded it, put it in his coat pocket, bought his supplies, drove home, and told Cutter she was coming Friday. Cutter nodded. "Good," he said, and went back to what he was doing. Poe, who had been within earshot, said nothing. But later that evening appeared at the door of the East Room where Gideon was working on the floor and said, "Floor needs a week to cure properly after you set it. You've got 2 days." "I know," Gideon said. "Just saying." "I know, Poe." Poe looked at the room. The plastered walls, the window, the new floorboards half laid. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who doesn't say many things but is thinking several. "She'll like the window," he said. Then he went back to the bunkhouse. Gideon worked until midnight. He didn't finish the floor. Poe was right. It needed time he didn't have. But he got far enough that the room was no longer a wound in the house. It was a room now. Unfinished still, in the way that rooms being built are always unfinished at some stage, but recognizably itself. A room with walls and a window and enough floor to stand on. He stood in it before he went to bed, in the dark, and looked out the east window at the night sky. Clear, for once. Stars thick across it, the way they only get in high country away from city light, which Black Hollow had never had enough of to ruin a night sky. Eleanor had wanted this window for the sunrise. He stood at it for a while, in the dark, and thought about the particular stubbornness of love. The way it doesn't ask your permission, doesn't arrive when it's convenient, doesn't confine itself to the people you've already planned for. He thought about the woman who had built this window into their plans before there was a house to put it in, and he thought about the woman coming on the Friday morning stage who had walked into his life with one trunk and a notebook full of lists and had, without any particular ceremony, made it impossible for him to keep living as though nothing mattered. I didn't think grief was gone. He wasn't that naive about it. But it had shifted, moved from the center of his chest to somewhere more peripheral, the way a scar settles after the wound closes. Still there, still real, but no longer the organizing fact of everything. He went to bed and slept. Friday came cold and clear, the sky the bright, hard blue of a March morning that means business. Gideon was at the stage depot 20 minutes before the stage was due, which he would have found embarrassing in himself 6 months ago and now simply accepted as the truth of where he was. He waited. The stage came around the eastern bend of the road at 9:30, right on schedule, which was unusual enough that Tom Harmon, who happened to be on his porch, noted it as remarkable. It pulled up to the depot platform with the driver calling down the arrival and the horses blowing hard from the last stretch of road. The door opened. The traveling merchant who'd shared her eastbound stage in January climbed out first, apparently making a return trip. Then an older man with a doctor's bag. Then Vivian. She looked different and entirely the same. The coat she was wearing was not Clara Rourke's borrowed wool. It was a better coat, deep charcoal gray, well made, the coat of a woman who had recently had access to a city's worth of options. Her hair was up and properly pinned, not the improvised arrangement of a woman managing on the frontier. She carried the same carpet bag, which he noticed immediately and which told him something about what she'd chosen to keep close on the journey. She stepped down from the stage and looked around the depot and found him. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she walked toward him, and he walked toward her, and they met in the middle of the depot platform in the bright March cold. She looked at him. He looked at her. She had lines around her eyes that he didn't think had been there in January, the lines of someone who had done hard work in a hard place, and she looked tired in the specific way of a person who has been carrying something heavy and has just set it down and is still adjusting to the absence of the weight. "Hello, Gideon," she said. "Hello, Vivian," he said. A pause. "You look terrible," she said. "You look," he started. "Don't say I look well. I haven't slept properly in 2 months." "I was going to say you look like yourself." She stopped. Something in her face shifted. "That's the kindest thing anyone said to me in 2 months," she said, and her voice had something in it that was not quite steady, which for Vivian was the equivalent of anyone else breaking down entirely. He picked up her trunk from the stage boot. It was heavier than the one she'd left with. "Books?" he said. "Some, and other things." She picked up the carpet bag. "I have a great deal to tell you." "You can tell me on the way." They walked to the wagon. He helped her up, and she let him, and they pulled out onto the road heading west toward the ranch. She told him about the final weeks in New York on the drive. She told him about Hargrove's second challenge and Dora Claiborne's response, which had been, by Vivian's account, a thing of precision and force that she described with the admiring exactness of someone who'd watched a master at work. She told him about the morning the settlement was signed, in a mahogany office with 6 men in suits who had spent 3 months trying to redirect her father's estate, and who now sat across from her with the careful faces of men recalibrating their positions. "Hargrove shook my hand at the end," she said. "Very formal. Very correct." She looked at the road ahead. He said, "I hope you know what you're doing with this, Miss Ashcroft." A pause. I said, "I know exactly what I'm doing with it, Mr. Hargrove," which was true, though I hadn't told anyone yet. Gideon glanced at her. What are you doing with it? She turned to look at him. That's the other part I need to tell you. She had spent the last 3 weeks in New York not celebrating the settlement but working, meeting with territorial education officials, with land surveyors, with a woman named Frances Alcott, who ran a charitable trust focused on frontier communities, and who had, upon hearing Vivian's account of Black Hollow, looked at her with the expression of someone who has been waiting for exactly this conversation. There are 11 settlements within 4 days' ride of Black Hollow, Vivian said. Most of them have children and no schools. Some of them have buildings that could be converted. All of them have families who would send their children if there was somewhere to send them. She was talking with the focused energy of someone who has been containing this for weeks and is finally allowed to let it out. I've committed funding for 3 schools in the first year, sites to be determined. Teachers to be recruited from the Eastern training colleges. Women who want to work and can't find positions in established districts. She paused. Black Hollow Schoolhouse becomes the central model. We've already done the hardest part, which is proving it works. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He was thinking about the battered notebook she'd carried on the stage from wherever she'd come from, the one he'd seen her writing in that first morning on the fence rail before he'd properly introduced himself. Lists. Futures, she'd called them. You planned this before you went east, he said. Some of it. She looked at her hands. I knew if I got control of the estate, I wanted to do something real with it, not just manage assets. She paused. My father spent his life building things that made money. I think that was meaningful to him. But I want to build things that change what's possible for people. She said it without grandiosity, in the same even voice she used for everything. Schools do that. I've seen it. I saw it under your cottonwood tree. They drove in silence for a moment. The ranch came into view around the last bend. She looked at it with the specific attention of someone returning to a place they've been carrying in their mind for months, checking the reality against the memory. Her eyes moved over the barn, the bunkhouse, the south field where the schoolhouse stood. Then she saw the east side of the house. She went still. The raw timber was gone. The boarded window was gone. In its place was a plastered wall, not painted yet, still bare plaster, and a proper window, 4 panes, facing east, catching the morning light and throwing it back in 4 clean squares. She didn't say anything for a moment. The floor's not finished, Gideon said. Ran out of time. She turned to look at him. Her dark eyes, which never gave much away, were giving something away right now, and she was not trying to stop it. Gideon, she said, I know it's not done. When did you start? He thought about February. About the night he'd pried the boards off the window frame and stood in the cold air looking at the east pasture and the ridge and the sky going gold at the edge. February, he said, after the trouble. She turned back to look at the window. They were at the fence now, the wagon pulling up to the gate. She didn't move to get down immediately. She sat and looked at the east side of the house in the morning light. Eleanor wanted it to face east, she said quietly. She had remembered, of course she had. She forgot nothing, this woman. Yes, he said. Are you? She stopped, started differently. Is this all right? Finishing it? He looked at her directly. It's the first right thing I've done with that room in 3 years, he said. So yes. She looked at him for a long moment. I want to see it, she said. He helped her down and they walked into the house, and he opened the door of the east room and she walked in and stood in the middle of the unfinished floor and looked at the plastered walls and the east window and the morning light coming through it in 4 pale rectangles across the boards. She stood there quietly. He stood in the doorway. It's a good room, she said finally. It will be, he said. She turned around. She was looking at him with the expression he'd seen once before. Briefly, on the morning of the first day of school in the new building, her hand on the blackboard, her face turned toward the children coming through the door. Undefended, the face of a person who is feeling something they didn't fully anticipate. I need to ask you something, he said. She waited. Not now, he said. Not in an unfinished room with no floor, but soon. She looked at him carefully. I'll be here, she said. I know, he said. That's why I'm going to finish the floor first. Something that was definitely a smile moved across her face, brief and genuine. That's a very practical approach to this situation. I'm a practical man. You're absolutely not, she said. A practical man doesn't spend February finishing a room he hasn't touched in 3 years. He held her gaze. No, he said. I suppose not. Well, he asked her 3 weeks later. Not with any particular ceremony. There was no ceremony in either of their natures, and they were both too old and too marked by their respective histories for gestures that were more about appearance than truth. The floor was done by then. The room still needed paint, but the floor was set and cured and level. And on the morning he finished it, Gideon had opened the east window and stood at it while the sunrise came up over the ridge, pink, and then gold. And then the hard, clear light of a March morning, exactly as Eleanor had imagined it 20 years ago, standing in this spot with a rope and iron stakes measuring the perimeter of a future. Vivian had heard him moving around early and come to the door of the east room and leaned in the doorway, still half asleep, her hair loose, watching the light come through the window. The floor's done, he said. She looked at it. It's a good floor. Poe helped with the far corner. I know, he told me. She paused. He's very proud of that corner. He should be. It's the best corner. She laughed. A real laugh, not contained, the laugh of someone who has come back to a place where laughing is possible. He had heard this laugh before, once or twice, and it still surprised him every time, the way certain things do when you haven't let yourself expect them. He turned from the window. She was leaning in the doorway in the morning light, and he looked at her and said, without preamble, because that was the only way to say it, I'd like you to stay, permanently, as my wife, if you're willing. I know what you're building, and I'm not asking you to stop any of it. I'm asking to be part of the life you're building it from. She was quiet. He added, because he felt it needed adding. I'm not easy. I know that. I was difficult before Eleanor, and worse after. I'm better than I was 6 months ago, but I'm still working on some things. I know, she said. And you still have the stone, he said. The river stone. I'm not the Connecticut River. This is not the same decision. She looked at him with the focused attention she gave to hard things. No, she said. It's not the same decision. A pause. It's a better one. He waited. Yes, she said. That's my answer. He nodded. She nodded. The morning light came through the east window and lay across the new floor in 4 clean squares, and neither of them said anything else for a moment, standing in the room that had been a wound and was now a room, in the house that had been a shell and was now, finally, something that deserved the name. They married in May, under the cottonwood tree. Not because anyone had organized it that way, but because when Vivian had mentioned the possibility of a ceremony to Clara Rourke, Clara had said the cottonwood with such immediate certainty that there was clearly no other option, and Vivian had said yes, with a brevity that meant she'd been thinking the same thing. It was not a large ceremony. It was not a small one either, because Black Hollow's community had grown in ways that made small gatherings increasingly difficult. 30-some adults came, plus children too numerous to count accurately because they refused to stand still. Daniel Hendricks came and stood in the back with his hat in his hands. Tom Harmon came with his wife, whom Gideon had rarely seen at public events, which was its own kind of statement. Even Houghton came, alone, standing at the edge of the gathering with his arms crossed and his face doing something that was not exactly warmth, but was at least the absence of its opposite. Cutter stood next to Gideon. He had combed his hair for the occasion, which was visible and touching. Poe stood on the other side. He was wearing his good shirt. He had not told anyone it was his good shirt, but it clearly was. Iris Hendricks stood with Clara Rourke's daughters in the second row and watched the whole thing with bright, serious eyes. And when it was over, she walked directly to Vivian and said, "You came back," in the tone of someone confirming a fact they had decided to believe in advance and are relieved to find accurate. "I told you I would," Vivian said. "I know," Iris said. "I just wanted to say it." The creek came back that summer. Not all at once. It came back the way it went dry, gradually, over weeks. First a seep at the upper end, then a trickle that was really more of a suggestion. Then by August, a genuine flow, shallow but real, running over the stones at Hester's Mill, with a sound that people in Black Hollow hadn't heard in 3 years, and some of the younger children hadn't heard at all. Iris Hendricks heard it before most people, because she walked the creek bed sometimes the way her composition had described, looking at the stones, the silt, the particular bend where her mother used to bring her when she was small. She heard it one early August morning and stood at the bank for a long moment and then ran to tell her father. And Daniel Hendricks drove the wagon to the creek and got down and stood at the bank and put his hand in the cold moving water and stayed there for a while. When Vivian heard, she walked out to the creek with Gideon and they stood at the bank together and looked at the water. The pastures will recover, Gideon said. I know. It'll take a season, maybe two. I know. She looked at the water moving over the stones. Iris wrote about this. I remember. They stood there for a while. The water was very cold and very clear, and it made the sound that running water makes over stones, which is one of those sounds that is difficult to describe, but impossible to forget once you've heard it in a place where it was absent for a long time. The second school breaks ground next month, Vivian said. The Millard Creek settlement. I know. You've told me. And the teacher, Miss Vargas, the one from Cincinnati, she arrives in September. Vivian. What? We're standing at a creek that just came back after 3 years, he said. Can we just stand here for a minute? She looked at him. A pause. Yes, she said. Sorry. They stood there. After a while she said, The East Room needs paint. I know. I was thinking blue. Blue's fine. Not a bright blue, a softer one, like she looked at the sky. That color, roughly. He looked up. The August sky above the ridge was exactly the color she meant, the particular muted blue of a summer morning that hasn't fully committed to the heat yet. That's a fine color for a room, he said. She looked at the sky for another moment. I want to put a table in there, for writing. The light in the mornings is good. It is. Eleanor was right about that window. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. She was. The creek moved over the stones. Somewhere upstream a kingfisher called twice and went silent. Gideon put his hand into the cold water and felt the current against his palm. Weak still, nothing like what it would be in a full year, but real, moving, going somewhere. Thought. The schoolhouse in Black Hollow stood for 40 years before it was replaced by a larger building, funded by the Hale Mercer Educational Trust, which by then had established 17 schools across 4 territories and had trained more than 200 teachers, most of them women who had come west for the same reason Vivian had, not because it was easy, but because it was where the work was. But that is later, and later is another kind of story. What mattered in the summer of 1888 was this. A community that had been dying found its feet, not because the land got easier, or the weather got kinder, or the cattle prices recovered all at once. None of those things happened quickly or without difficulty. But because enough people chose, at a moment when choosing otherwise was possible, to stand in the same direction. And in a ranch house 3 miles from Black Hollow, in a room with a new floor and plaster walls and a window that faced east, a woman sat at a table in the morning light and wrote in a notebook that was not the battered one from her carpet bag, but a new one, though the river stone sat on the table beside it, small and dark and worn smooth by a hand that had carried it for a very long time. Gideon brought her coffee without being asked. He set it beside the stone and looked at what she was writing. Lists, of course, always lists. The machinery of a mind that was always 3 steps ahead of itself. Sit down, she said without looking up. You're looming. I'm not looming. I'm standing in my own kitchen. You loom when you stand. Sit down. He sat. He drank his own coffee. Outside, the morning was coming up clear and warm, the cottonwood throwing its new-leafed shadow across the south field, the creek audible in the quiet if you listened for it. She wrote. He drank his coffee. The house settled into the comfortable noise of a house that has people in it, which is different from the quiet of a house that doesn't, in ways that are specific and irreducible and impossible to fully articulate to someone who hasn't experienced both. He had spent 3 years in the second kind. He was not going to spend a single unnecessary moment failing to notice the first. What are you writing? He asked. Sites for the third school. Where? I'm deciding between the Kettle Creek settlement and the Bower Homestead area. She tapped the pencil against her lip. The Bower area has more children but worse road access. Roads improve. That's what I said. Then you've already decided. She looked up at him, her dark eyes in the morning light. Yes, she said. I suppose I have. He nodded. He looked out the window. Not the east window, but the kitchen window facing south, through which the cottonwood was visible, and beyond it the schoolhouse with Tom Harmon's door. There was a thing he had understood, sometime in the months since Vivian came back. Not a revelation, nothing that dramatic. More the kind of understanding that arrives so gradually you don't notice until it's already become part of how you see things. He had spent 3 years believing that the unfinished East Room was his failure, the thing he couldn't do, the proof that grief had beaten him in some permanent way. But that was not what it was. The room was unfinished because the person who was supposed to share it wasn't there yet. That was all. Not failure, just waiting, in the way that certain rooms wait, patient and cold, for the light that will eventually come through the window someone planned for them. Eleanor had planned the window. Vivian sat at the table it lit. Neither of those things canceled the other. Both of them were true, which is the way it actually works, though people spend considerable energy trying to make it simpler than that. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He put his cup in the wash basin and looked at the south field and the school and the road that ran east toward town. "I'm going to check the north fence," he said. "The north fence is fine." "I know. I'm going to check it anyway." She didn't look up from her notebook. "Take the gray. She needs the exercise." "I was going to take the gray." "I know." She wrote something down. "Take a coat. It's not warm yet." He took his coat from the hook by the door. He paused with his hand on the door and looked at her, at the back of her head, the ink-stained fingers, the river stone on the table beside the coffee cup. "Vivienne," he said. Nothing," he said. "Just nothing." She looked up then. She looked at him the way she had looked at him from the stage door in January, in the cold morning light, the look that gave things away. "Go check your fence," she said, not unkindly. He went. The morning was cool and bright, the kind of morning that makes you believe, without much justification, but with considerable conviction that whatever comes next is manageable. The gray mare was glad to move, and he let her set her own pace through the south field, past the cottonwood, past the schoolhouse where Vivian's fractions were still on the blackboard and would be replaced this morning by something new. At the ridge above the east pasture, he stopped. The same ridge he'd stopped on 3 years ago on a cold fall morning, looking down at the basin and the town and his own ranch in the middle ground. He stopped now and looked. The creek was visible from here, a thin silver line through the lower pasture, moving. The town was the same collection of buildings it had always been, but it did not look the same. It was hard to say exactly what was different, because the buildings hadn't changed, and the street hadn't widened, and the population was not dramatically larger. But a town that knows what it is, and has defended that knowledge, has a different quality than a town that doesn't, and Black Hollow knew what it was now. That was visible somehow, even from a ridge in the early morning, and in the house below him, a room with a window facing east was full of light. He sat on the gray mare on the ridge for a while, just looking, not at anything in particular, just at the place he'd chosen and the life he'd made in it, which was broken in certain ways it would always be, and whole in other ways he hadn't known to expect. Then he rode down to check the fence, which was, as Vivian had said, entirely fine. He checked it anyway. Some habits are worth keeping, and some mornings are worth being slow in, worth letting run through your hands like water, worth noticing the weight and temperature of, so that later, when you are asked what your life felt like at its best, you will have something true to say. The creek ran below him, shallow and cold and persistent. He rode along the fence line in the morning light, and the grass was beginning very slowly to come back green,